Chapter 149. Dead? No one here could surpass Gila's understanding of life. But because of this, Huaishur found it hard to believe. Kush was probably already dead. The moment he let go of Jago in pain, the once arrogant demon king and immortal died under the water of the Styx, ushering in his own end. But even if his soul had completely melted into the darkness that he had created, there was still something that death could not erase in this world. Just like the sacred remains of the sage stone after it passed away. After struggling at death's door for hundreds of years, Kush had tried everything he could to resist the death that should have come a long time ago. But when death came, he chose not to resist. Instead, he engraved his last will on his soulless corpse. This was his last will, his last wish, and his last order. At that moment, in the roar, the dark substance sealed in his body exploded and swallowed everything. In the end, his killing intent materialized and swept through the lone boat on the vast sea along with the pitch-black flood, swallowing and annihilating all life. At this moment, Mayflower trembled under the power of his own death and almost collapsed. They cannot escape anymore. If the root cause was not eliminated as soon as possible, this ship would definitely not be able to last until the New World. But how? It was impossible to kill them all. Huaishur roared and slashed a figure that rushed up. When he looked back, he only saw that the red moon seemed to have melted into the darkness outside the porthole. As far as the eye could see, there was a scarlet color. It was like an ocean of blood. They had nowhere to run. Water, I need water. Lily's footsteps suddenly stopped and looked in the direction of the front deck pool. Give me enough water, I can hold him back, follow me. There was no time to listen to her explanation. Huaishur struggled to throw an empty bottle of blood on the ground, pulled out a short knife, and covered Lily as they rushed to the upper deck. Along the way, Huaishur saw more than once the escaping passengers were swallowed by the monsters in the mud, and more monsters were chasing after them. There was an endless amount of black sludge, as well as countless limbs and rotten bodies that crawled out of it. Who the F***CK knew how many living things Kush had devoured over the years. Not only humans, but there were also all kinds of unusual creatures and monsters, whether it was the two-headed giant eagle, hellhounds, or the long-extinct deer people. It was like a biological expo. There were only things that had never been seen before, and nothing that had never been eaten before. It can only be said that this old bastard's appetite was really good. When they reached the foredeck, they saw nothing but a bloody scene. Passengers were everywhere, trying to flee or resist in vain. Amidst the mess and blood, all the monsters turned their heads to look at the new intruder. The terrifying scale made Huaishur swallow a mouthful of saliva. Lily, if you still can't come up with a solution, this time we'll really be delivering ourselves to their doorstep. Lily stood in front of the pool as if she didn't hear anything. She tore a piece of paper from her notebook and quickly wrote something. Then, she threw the heavy bag into the pool. In the blink of an eye, the whole pool started to boil, and a pungent smell emerged from it. Nothing could be seen clearly in the thick, pale fog. It was like boiling cold water with quicklime. When Lily cut her finger, viscous blood dripped down from her fingertip, forming a thin line that flowed into the pool. Golden blood. When that drop of blood appeared on Lily's fingertip, Lily's face instantly turned pale, and she almost couldn't stand still. Huaishur almost couldn't control his thirst. He swallowed a mouthful of saliva and tried his best to restrain his urge to rush up and lick her finger. Soon, the blood blended into the huge pool. The terrifying abnormality made all the monsters pause for a moment. Soon, a muddy monster that was either a cheetah or a lion could no longer hold back its murderous intent. It leaped over the pool and pounced toward Lily. Lily had just thrown the paper in her hand into the boiling water. Huaishur raised his axe. What was faster than him was a thick arm that suddenly rose from the mist. The 5 fingers covered in calluses opened and grabbed the paper. Then the other hand grabbed the monster's thigh and clenched it tightly, throwing it to the edge of the pool with all its might. There was a smack. The muddy mud collapsed. The sturdy middle-aged man with mottled white hair and a red brandy nose walked out of the pool with his big belly. Was it awakened again? Forget it. It doesn't matter. He spat a mouthful of thick phlegm on the ground and moved his stiff neck. The muscles on his thick arms bulged. His seemingly drunk eyes slowly looked up and glanced around indifferently. It was like a baby that had just been born. He was naked. Please wait a moment. Lily rummaged through her purse in a flurry and finally found the wilted flower. Your flower. Ah, thank you. The captain grinned and revealed a happy smile. He carefully took it and deeply inhaled the remaining fragrance. Then he pinned the withered flower branch between his mottled white hair. His fierce eyes became gentle. Then, little girl, please step back, he said. I'm going to start working. He casually pulled a tattered bath towel from the recliner and wrapped it around his waist. Then, the recliner that was welded to the deck was pulled up by him and slammed into the monsters in front of him. So many people sneaked onto my ship. The captain roared. Did you buy tickets? The dead in the mud roared. They did not seem to have a trace of remorse at all. So, the captain became even angrier. His muscles bulged, and his whole body emitted a high temperature like a furnace. The soles of his feet crushed the deck and made a violent roar. He rushed forward. Boom! Like a cannonball falling into a quagmire. Countless mud splashed out in an instant. Behind him, the cyborg crew members who had died in the daytime climbed out of the pool one by one, spitting out the amniotic fluid in their lungs. They nodded to Lily as they passed by, and then turned a blind eye to Huai-Shur. They picked up the messy things on the ground and then rushed to the monsters that were besieging them. For a time, the front deck was full of naked, muscular men carrying all kinds of strange things to fight the monsters. Huai-Shur only felt that his eyes were deeply hurt. He was already prepared for his allies to die in an instant. But soon his jaw was about to fall off. That group of burly, muscular crewmen actually relied on their unreasonable strength and speed to forcibly hold back the spreading sludge. It was as if 70 or 80 Arnolds suddenly jumped out of the pool, each with a head of copper and arms of iron, with a body of iron and bones of iron. Huai-Shur saw with his own eyes that several monsters opened their big mouths and bit their skulls, but their teeth were about to break. Encountering this kind of skull, no mace could withstand it, even if they were seriously injured under the siege of the monsters. After taking 2 steps back, they would take out a box of canned vegetables from some corner and pour it into their mouth. And after chewing it twice, they would quickly return to their original state and continue to fight without fear of death. Huai-Shur picked up a few empty cans and looked at them for a long time in disbelief. They were not magical relics or alchemy potions. They were really all canned spinach. What the hell, spinach? What kind of scientific principle is this? Huai-Shur was dumbfounded. It was simply a miracle. Not only did they create an army of cyborgs in one go, but they also gave them incredible strength and strength on top of their original foundation. Huai-Shur secretly calculated the amount of life force required and could only come up with a terrifying number. Even for a scholar who was proficient in the science of life, it was an extravagant delusion. But for Lily, who was also a cyborg, it was so simple. Her own blood was the quintessential miracle, which could be broken down and processed into any inferior material at any time. No, it could be said that Lily, who was registered as the goddess of the underworld, was the manifestation of pure life. With this group of fearless cyborgs, the tide of darkness transformed by Kush was actually contained. The situation seemed to be turning for the better. Just when Huai-Shur's tense mood relaxed a little, he felt a violent tremor under his feet. In the direction of the rear deck, there was a roar of an explosion. It was as if a crazy passenger had completely broken through the deck of the ship. The short-circuited wires brought flames, igniting everything. Thick smoke and flames rose. The cruise ship was wailing. The miracle that the White Crown King had cast on the ship was gradually losing its effect. Under the illumination of the flames, on the cracked rails, the sails that were riddled with holes swelled in the wind. Debris constantly peeled off from the gorgeous cruise ship and fell into the sea, gradually melting into a handful of mud. The original appearance of the sail ship appeared. It was as if it was absorbing the lives of the dead, full of killing and death. Its speed was getting faster and faster, as if it was flying above the sea of blood. Don't waste any more time, bastard. In the midst of the fighting, the captain turned around, with a pipe in his mouth that he had snatched from somewhere, and roared at Huaishur. If this continues, this ship is going to sink. If you still want to live to reach the new world, hurry up and get to work. A crack had already appeared on his face. It was obvious that under such rough driving, his body, like a ship, would not be able to hold on for much longer. Without needing him to urge, Huaishur had already taken this opportunity to rush into the depths of the tide of origin substance. After a few nimble jumps, he finally returned to the mess of dead and injured in the restaurant. Breaking through the last half of the remaining glass, he jumped into the mess and seized the momentary opportunity to look around. In the legends, Kush was good at hiding his soul outside of his body to avoid the enemy's attacks. Because of this, he earned the name of an immortal and an immortal. According to Huaishur's speculation, since he had decided to leave his hometown, Kush naturally would not leave his soul in the enemy's territory. He would definitely carry a container to preserve his soul with him. Even if his soul was now shattered, it was still the basis of this terrifying obsession. Soon, he saw the wheelchair that was still intact under the corrosion of the decaying origin substance in the surging mud. It's here. Huaishur ignored the wind behind him and raised the axe in his hand, throwing it with all his might into the mud. In the blink of an eye, after the shrill sound of breaking air, there was the sound of steel breaking. The wheelchair fell apart. Chapter 150. After a wail, the wheelchair fell apart in the mud. In the blink of an eye, the mud shook violently. It worked? Huaishur was overjoyed. Then he felt a chill in his chest, and a military knife protruded from his chest. As expected, it didn't work. When he turned around in a daze, he saw Clement, who seemed to have crawled out of the mud, and his ferocious face. A pitch-black aura constantly emerged from his body. "Oh my God, you're also a traitor?" Huaishur was stunned. At that moment, the dark substance that had been silent for a moment shook violently again, triggering a riot, and swept in all directions more violently than before. Clement opened his mouth and suddenly spat out the dark substance that had drilled into his lungs. His scarlet eyes were filled with frenzy. "Can't," he murmured hoarsely, "can't stop." Since the beginning of the game, his former teammate, the unlucky child Clement, who had turned into an NPC. No, at this moment, how much of him was the original him? As the black mud covered him, his coat rustled, and soon it turned into a solemn, pitch-black robe. No matter whether it was the bow tie or the cuffs, they were all meticulously done. His distorted face calmed down again, and he was already unrecognizable. Without the desolation and paleness of many years of frustration, he became arrogant and handsome, with deep indifference and cruelty, just like a natural emperor. This was the real Kush. Not the pitiful worm in the wheelchair who couldn't even speak properly, but the terror and disaster that walked the world, the immortals, the undying, the shapeshifters, the wizards, and the demon king who swallowed all enemies, even though he was already dead. However, that huge obsession still relied on other people's bodies to walk in this world, bringing destruction and death. Huaishur opened his mouth and spat out a mouthful of blood. "Brother, we're already dead. Can't we just stop?" "Can't stop." Yet he raised his head stiffly and stared at Huaishur's face. "At least let Yaga go to the new world. If you don't King mess around, everyone can go to the new world alive." In that instant, Koseki pulled out his military knife and slashed at Huaishur's head again. Huaishur turned around in an instant, blood spurting out from his chest. He raised the saber and axe in his hand, blocking the swift and fierce sword. He felt a burst of numbness in his wrist. The terrifying power and killing intent almost stunned him. The wound on his chest was not that important. Lice don't itch when there are too many. Compared to the torture of the punishment for breaking an oath, this pain was like being bitten by a mosquito. As for the damage caused by the puncture, it was nothing to Huaishur now that he was high on drugs. Huaishur took a step back amidst the clanging sound of steel colliding. He lowered his head to look at the wound on his chest that was slowly healing. He raised his head to stare at Kush, who was closing in on him. His solemn footsteps were precise to the millimeter, and his posture was flawless. When he raised his military saber to his chest, His eyes were cold and solemn, as well as a wave of killing intent that burst forth. Huaisher took a deep breath and felt his palms begin to sweat. For the first time since he boarded the ship, he encountered such a flawless opponent. But for some reason, what followed was not fear, but excitement. It was the joy and anticipation of meeting a worthy opponent. Therefore, the short saber and axe were spread out from his side as he raised his arms. The Theravada dual saber technique, which had been changed beyond recognition, was now revealed. Whether it was a Roman dagger fight or something else, Huaisher was eager to change his posture, looking for an attacking distance from both sides as they advanced and retreated. In that instant, the leather boots of both of them stood still on the broken floor at the same time. The blood-red pupils burst forth with the light of killing intent. The undead and the vampire broke through the air at that moment. The radiance of steel collided with each other, bursting out a sharp sound, followed by a series of thunderous roars. It was the mournful sound of an axe and a military saber breaking through the air. With only a narrow Slavic military saber, Kush closed in step by step, suppressing Huaisher's dual weapons. He conveyed his strength and will through the narrow saber in an almost violent manner. He forcefully resisted the slashing of the axe and swung his fist at Huaisher's inner elbow. After parrying the saber, he raised his fist and smashed it on Huaisher's chin. Huaisher only felt his vision go black. Immediately, he felt his feet leave the ground. He was actually suspended in the air by this punch. Then, the military saber slashed and cut open a wound in his chest. In midair, his short saber fell from his hand and pierced through Kush's left arm. Both of them took a step back. Huaisher panted violently. He felt his ears ringing, a bloody taste oozing out of his mouth, and a stinging pain in his chest. The cut was so deep that his bones could be seen. Kush pulled out the blade, nailed to his arm expressionlessly, and raised the military saber again. Huaisher shook his head and tried to dispel the dizziness in his head. He clenched the handle of the axe tightly. "What a pity," he whispered softly. "It would be nice if there was some background music." He missed old Lou like never before. He desperately hoped that he would give him another MP3 player, the kind that cost 20 to 30,000. As if hearing his prayer, the cruise ship roared and the ceiling shattered. A line of sparks flew down and ignited the table in the corner. A flame was ignited. The light illuminated the scarlet eyes of both of them. Huaisher's face was reflected in Kush's hollow eyes. It seemed that a trace of brutal excitement emerged. He clenched the military saber tightly. Again, Huaisher growled and rushed forward again. Bang! The blade of the axe and the military saber collided, creating sparks. Both of them raised their fists at the same time and punched each other in the face. They took a step back, then clenched their weapons and slashed at each other with a mournful cry. A sharp roar burst forth. Huaisher roared. Amidst the sound of burning and shattering, iron collided with iron, stirring up each other. The vampire and the immortal clenched their fists and moved forward again. The metallic light was like a stream of water bursting out from the scorching air. It illuminated their scarlet eyes. Do you see it? The atmosphere is starting to heat up. Huaisher tilted his head and spat out a mouthful of poisonous blood. He muttered softly, "It's a pity that there's no applause." Kush's face was expressionless. He took a step forward and slashed again with his saber. Amidst the roar of the shattering, flames spread, eroding the deck inch by inch. The sludge formed by the dark origin substance was turbulent. It erupted 3 times like a tide, making it difficult for all the cyborg sailors to suppress it. But when the burly captain smashed a door and pulled out an iron box from a crack in the wall, the situation reversed once again. Inside the box, a row of black guns that did not belong to this era shone with a cold steel light. "Huh, old buddy." The captain, who had a pipe in his mouth, laughed sinisterly. He pulled out a machine gun that should have been welded to a tank, dragged a long chain of bullets, and pulled the trigger at the monsters formed by the dark origin substance. Gunfire roared. Thunder and lightning burst forth from the rotating muzzle. Die, 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 die. After the fatal chain of fire, The captain's angry roar could be heard. This is what happens to trash like you if you don't buy tickets. The other crew members also picked up their guns and short cannons from the box and rushed toward the enemy. They changed from Iron King Kong to Rambo, fighting the monsters without fear of death. In an instant, the scene changed from the Middle Ages to a modern army fighting monsters. "Oh my God, give me one too." Huaishi's eyes were red with envy. "Give me one, give me one. No more." The captain glanced at him from the corner of his eyes. "Why are you playing with guns at such a young age? Go play with your axe." Bang! Huaishi wasn't paying attention and was knocked back by Kush. He almost fell into the hole in the floor. Kush closed in step by step, swinging his knife again. Then a loud sound burst forth. A huge gap appeared on Kush's head. Behind the gap, Lily, who was at the entrance of the restaurant, was holding the rifle that had killed the pharaoh. She was panting heavily. The Demon King's movements were sluggish. Huaishi roared angrily, and the axe in his hand chopped down at the Demon King's face. Kush retreated. The blade of the axe split open his sternum, and blood spurted out. But Kush's movements didn't stop. The military knife in his hand fell, but he saw Huaishi raise his left hand. He faced the blade and gripped it tightly. In a momentary stalemate, Huaishi raised his head and slammed it down on Kush's broken head. Kush staggered and took a step back. Huaishi advanced again, and the blade of the axe chopped down, cutting off his left arm. Then, Huaishi roared and charged forward. Using the broken body as support, he suddenly slammed it onto the table. He kicked with all his might. Kush fell to the ground. Chance! Huaishi gripped the blade of the axe with both hands and aimed it at his head. With a roar, he chopped it down. This time, he had no way out, but a fierce light burst forth from his empty eyes. He raised the broken military knife, but he didn't dodge or block. Instead, he stabbed it toward Huaishi's head. Mutual destruction. At that moment, a crisp sound suddenly rang out in the restaurant. Kush's movements froze, and he stopped in place. The blade of the axe splashed blood, leaving deep gouges on the floor. Victory and defeat had been decided, but it wasn't just the broken body that stopped. Even the surging tide of darkness stiffened in place, as if it had been frozen. Then, an ear-piercing wail burst forth. Huaishi turned around and saw Lily, who had thrown herself into the middle of the restaurant, and her raised hands. It was a soup spoon that had been broken. That was Kush's last resort. So, in an instant, the surging tide of darkness rolled back. Countless monsters wailed as they melted and gathered in the quagmire again. The mud convulsed and collapsed, quickly evaporating. In the end, only a decrepit and old body was left, falling to the ground. It was the last remnant of the Demon King named Kush. It was about to dissipate. The stooped old man tried to reach out with his hand, trying to feel for something, but he couldn't touch anything. In the end, his hand fell limply, and Yaga rushed forward and grabbed it tightly. "Brother, I'm here. I'm here." The decrepit old man tried hard to open his eyes, trying to see her clearly. After a long time, he finally distinguished that haggard face. As if he had been liberated, a smile of relief appeared on his face from fear. "Run, Yaga, run." The old man's voice was hoarse as he shouted her name with all his might. "Run, run to a place where they can't catch you. Liable." In the rapid dissipation, Kush shed murky tears as he stared at his last family member. "I'm sorry." This was his final farewell. His body dissipated in the wind. In the end, only a handful of scattered dust was left, falling on Yaga's burnt skirt. "Big brother, we already have nowhere to run." Yaga stared blankly at the gravel that flowed down her palm. The wrinkles on her face twitched as if she wanted to cry, but she couldn't shed any tears. The unkempt which shook her head numbly. She looked around at all this, at everyone's faces, as if she was looking at a joke. From the moment we boarded the ship, everything was already destined. We are all dust, dust left behind by the wheels." No one responded. No one was able to respond to her voice. There were only corpses everywhere. Almost all the passengers had died. Huaishi's subconsciously shielded Lily behind him, carefully guarding against her. But he didn't see her rush forward madly to avenge her brother, as he expected. She just stared blankly at all this. After a long, long time, scarlet tears flowed from the corners of her eyes. Slowly, she raised her hands and covered her old face, but it was difficult to suppress the despair and sadness in her heart. Why? Why? She choked and asked hoarsely, "Who can tell me, why is this happening? My husband, my daughter, my everything. God, isn't it enough to take all of this away? Why do you have to take him away from me? Tell me." She held the ashes of her brother in her hands and screamed at the cold, dark sky outside the broken wall. Why is this happening? The world was silent. There was only the sound of flames burning and her broken cries. She climbed up from the ground, stepping on the broken wreckage. With tears of blood, she looked up at the sky and screamed, "I curse all of you. I curse all of you. One day, you will die in your ambition that even this world can't accommodate. I curse all of you. Do you hear me? Do you hear me?" No one responded. In the dead silence, she seemed to have finally understood something and lowered her head tiredly. "At least, I won't be your plaything. Never, never." She finally turned around and looked at the cyborgs, Huaishur and Lily behind him, as if she was pitying them. Shaking his head slightly, he leaped into the air. Quietly, she fell into the quiet sea of blood and gradually sank into the darkness that was difficult to be seen by the naked eye. Silently melted. In the dead silence, no one spoke. Huaishur looked down at her in disbelief until the numb face disappeared in the deepest part of the darkness. Until now, he still couldn't believe that Papaya had chosen to commit suicide. Was she crazy? She must be crazy. AI Ching knocked on the armrest. But why she went crazy is still unknown. Besides, you'd better worry about yourself. AI Ching lowered her eyes and stared at the countdown in the status bar of the character card. Punishment for breaking an Oath 003. Countdown 3, 2, 1. At that moment, Huaishur widened his eyes in shock and staggered to the ground. He saw the silver circuits slowly emerging on the back of his hand. They burned his flesh and blood. Sizzling and unprecedented pain and thirst struck him. He was almost defeated in an instant. The roars of countless people echoed in his ears and turned into a dark tide, drowning his soul inch by inch. Paracelsus, kill. Kill that deformed creation. Kill at all costs. Kill. 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 Countless chaotic voices echoed in his consciousness and instantly drained all his energy, causing him to spasm and twitch violently on the floor. It was like an epileptic patient. In a trance, Huaishur felt that his consciousness seemed to be pulled out by an invisible force and thrown into the darkness. The sound of the wind blew past his face. The fall seemed to be endless. After a long time that was long enough for his consciousness to disappear, he finally fell to the bottom of the abyss. He prostrated himself under the pale altar. Holy light shone from above and scattered on his body. It was like sulfuric acid being evenly splashed on a vampire's skin, causing him to scream and his soul to tremble. In the burning holy flames, the thin archbishop held his scepter and slowly turned around. He looked down at the screaming Huaishur and said coldly, "Don't always disappoint people, Abraham. Complete your mission." His every word was like a hammer, pounding on Huaishur's remaining consciousness and ravaging his will. The part of him that belonged to the vampire quickly expanded, bringing with it the commandments and missions that went deep into his soul. He said, "Kill that damned heretic." No. In the midst of his convulsions, Huaishur raised his face covered in snot and saliva and gave him an apologetic smile. "Sorry, I refuse." At that moment, the archbishop frowned in disappointment. The holy light left. Huaishur was abandoned in the abyss. Then, AI Ching saw. The last player sitting opposite her revealed a ferocious smile from the shadows. He threw the dice in his hand. When Huaishur opened his eyes in a daze, he saw Lily's pale face and felt a wave of hunger. Then he felt a sharp pain in his limbs. When he tried to raise his head, he heard a crisp sound from his neck, as if something was about to break. He raised his arms with difficulty and saw his 10 fingers that were as shriveled as withered twigs and his arms that were covered in cracks, just like charcoal that had been burnt out. Silver, commandments, missions, everything that Abraham once believed and was collapsing little by little. From the inside out, he was killed inch by God's wrath. From inside out, no blind spots were left. Perhaps this was the redemption that Van Helsing was looking forward to. Fleischer could clearly feel that this was originally a setting hidden in the vampire stigmata. Through his shallow knowledge of metals, he could sensitively perceive the essence of this miracle. A miracle from the darkness forged in the silver cornerstone. The almost ingenious construction of the power of a mutant gave it unparalleled lethality. Then, on the first day of its birth, it was destined to perish one day. All that was needed was a gentle push from above, and everything that was floating in the air would collapse like a pile of sand, vanishing in a thin air under the purification of the silver alloy that was poured into the bone marrow. In the end, only a silver-white skeleton was left. This was the final punishment for breaking the oath. Chapter 151. No, this is not right either. Lily's face was pale, and she stared blankly at the broken potion bottles on the ground. No matter what method she tried, there was no way to stop the silver flames spreading in his body. It was like pulling out the most crucial piece from the stack of building blocks. Collapse and destruction were inevitable. This was the limitation of nature. He was destroying himself. No matter how many life-prolonging potions were injected, it was like putting out a fire with firewood. It was useless in front of this structure that was bound to self-destruct. Perhaps it was as the Holy Spirit genealogy said. Unless it was really the mercy of the gods, he could no longer be saved. Perhaps from the beginning, he was destined not to receive the so-called salvation. No, it should be said that the salvation promised by the church had long been implanted in his bone marrow along with the blessed silver and holy objects. With just a small signal, a fatal chain would purify the vampire's original sin and vampire together. Death was the ultimate release. As for whether the illusory gate of heaven would open for him, it was not within the scope of the church's consideration. Without guessing, Fleischer could see the scene of his character summon cards HP being rapidly deducted. Little by little, it was directly erased from the upper limit until the moment it reached 0. Everything would come to an end. Ah, is this the fate of a traitor? In a trance, Fleischer whispered softly, feeling a drop of water falling on his face. There were still people by his side, trying in vain to do anything again and again, until they completely fell into despair. Save him. Lily raised her head and stared at her own kind, almost crying out, "Doesn't the White Crown King have any other gifts? Anything that can save people is good." All the crew members were silent, lowering their eyes in pity. "Sorry, child." The captain looked away. "You need to understand that for puppets like us who can't decide when to be born and when to die, the power to save others is too extravagant." Lily looked at him blankly, as if she could not accept it. After a long time, she lowered her head tiredly and stared at her hands. She could not help but choke with sobs. "But clearly, I've already gotten life." No one spoke again. They lowered their eyes. "I'm not dead yet. Can you guys not put on a solemn look like you're about to lay a wreath?" Fleischer tried his best to open his eyes, but he heard the sound of his eyelids cracking. The fine cracking sound spread across his face, and as he propped himself up, more and more sounds burst out from his body. "Help me up," Fleischer said softly. "I can still see you off." Under everyone's stunned expressions, Fleischer climbed up from the ground, supported himself with his axe, raised his head with difficulty, and looked around. Then he took a deep breath. "Hey, friend. I'm about to die, so you have to come out and see me, right?" He roared with all his might, feeling as if his lungs were about to burst. "Or are you saying that you're going to hide until the very end and not show your face?" In the silence, everyone looked at each other. In the end, their gazes actually gathered behind Fleischer, full of shock and astonishment. A huge shadow had unknowingly appeared behind Fleischer. No, he was sitting on the ground, From the very beginning, he had been quietly enjoying all of this, sitting in the VIP seats close by, watching this battle play out. But no one noticed, no one noticed. Under the hood, a familiar sigh came. To be honest, I didn't plan to do this. I wanted to at least let you be my last farewell. As he spoke, he lifted the hood, revealing a face. Yujun? Huaisher was stunned for a moment, frowning. It was actually Yujun, who was beheaded on the first night. But no, he had already seen his corpse, which was almost rotten. Or could he have survived with only his head left? No, it wasn't Yujun. Even if AI Qing was silent now, Huaisher could make such a judgment based on the clues she had given him before. Who are you? HM? I thought you would admit your mistake like Yin. Yujun pinched his chin, raised his eyebrows slightly, and his voice became hoarse and low. To be honest, it's not polite to meet people with this face. Unfortunately, in order to make you believe that I died, my original head was also beaten up. You see, along the way, I pieced together a ship of Theseus from the Mayflower, and in the end, only my head is left. He joked leisurely, pulled up his hair slightly, and showed Huaisher the fine scars below. Huaisher was stunned. Old Shaw? Yes, it's me. Old Shaw nodded. Yujun's expression was calm, not knowing whether it was the new head not working well, or he was always so calm and collected. You killed Yujun? Lei Feijo and I. Old Shaw shrugged slightly. We formed an alliance on the first day on the ship, but Yujun saw it, you know. What about Yin? It was also me. Old Shaw replied frankly. To complete my secret, I needed Yaga's resurrection potion in his hands, but he refused to give it to me. Let me guess. Huaisher smiled. I'm next. Even if I don't do it, you're going to die, aren't you? Old Shaw glanced at the fragments peeling off his face with pity. To be honest, I once regarded you as my strongest competitor. After all, your performance was, well, it was amazing, almost impossible to guard against. Moreover, before this, you had the strongest lethality of all of us. An executioner of the Holy Spirit lineage was a perfect match for you. I made so many precautions against you, but I didn't expect that you couldn't even complete your own secret. As if everything was as clear as day, he calmly stated the facts. Unfortunately, Huaisher, you're going to lose this game. Should I congratulate you for being the champion of the betrayal competition? Huaisher asked indifferently, clenching the handle of the axe in his hand. Is the achievement that you and I have achieved really important, Huaisher? You don't have to be angry about it, just like I won't be proud of it. Old Shaw suddenly laughed. In the end, aren't we all chess pieces? Even if we call ourselves players, we are still bound by the rules, and it's difficult to transcend the chessboard of the gods. From the beginning, our mission and will have already determined everything that we have today, not from the so-called luck and coincidence. Maybe KP holds the dice in his hand and tells you that it's all probability, but he doesn't tell you that the gods never throw dice. Everything is destined, Huaisher. He stared at the young man in front of him, but as if he was looking at AI Qing outside the chessboard, he told him word by word. The ending was already decided before the beginning. And now, it's just time for the curtain call. Why be angry or sad? You want to tell me that everything is destined, and then what? So that you can accept what you've done with a clear conscience? Huaisher asked. Or do you feel that you have no choice, so you don't need to feel any burden? But that doesn't prevent me from winning, does it? Old Shaw said coldly. If you have any last words, I hope you can say them quickly. I'm in a hurry. Do what? Huaisher laughed. Reincarnate. Old Shaw also laughed. Kill, of course. At that moment, a bestial gloominess appeared on that calm face, full of murderous intent. Then, the iron light burst forth and thunder roared. The axe blade broke through the air, and an unprecedented cold light bloomed from Huaisher's hand. It was as if the pain of breaking an oath did not exist, and from his broken face, the dark pupils were ignited, like the burning hell, ruthless and ferocious. What a coincidence, Huaisher said. Me too. At that moment, all the cyborgs who were on standby raised the weapons in their hands, aimed at Old Shaw's huge body, and pulled the triggers. Deadly gunfire turned into a torrential rain, gushing out. In the blink of an eye, Old Shaw was engulfed. Countless pieces of burning steel pierced through his flesh and blood body, causing tragic injuries. In the blink of an eye, he was chiseled into rotten flesh riddled with holes. Amidst Huaishi's roar, the axe blade flashed and chopped off the grinning head. The huge body crashed to the ground, blood spreading everywhere. "Bah, I thought you were more powerful." The captain spat out a mouthful of thick phlegm in disdain. "Just average." "That's it." In the pool of blood, Yu Jun's head slowly rolled, his lips moving. "Is there anything else?" Huaishi was stunned. Then he saw a mocking smile on that face. "Guess what my mission is?" At that moment, Huaishi saw a black shadow fly out from under Old Shaw's broken cloak, whistling towards him like a sharp blade. In an instant, the terrifying speed was even higher than that of a vampire. Even with Huaishi's reflexes, he could not detect it. He only realized that he had been attacked by the afterimages he saw. When he lowered his head, he only saw a curled tentacle slowly retracting, and there was a big hole in his chest. Between the bones that were gradually metallized, there was a tear that penetrated from his chest to his back. In an instant, all of Huaishi's defenses had been shattered by this devastating blow. Then, the tentacle curled up slightly, as if it was facing a gentle breeze and drizzle, and it swept across casually, ignoring the countless bullets that were fired at it. Bang! The axe in Huaishi's hand flew out, flying in the air, and finally fell obliquely to the ground, cutting into the broken deck. And Huaishi had already flown out and smashed into the ruins. Countless cracks spread on his broken body, like porcelain that was barely glued back together after being smashed. It was about to fall apart. In the intense dizziness and trance, Huaishi heard Old Shaw's words. It was like asking and answering his own question. He slowly got up from the ground, bathed in the storm of bullets, slowly picked up Yu Jun's head, and put on his neck again. It was as if he was wearing a hat. The flesh and blood closed, and no abnormalities could be seen. "My mission is actually very simple." He smiled and pulled off the tattered cloak wrapped around his body, revealing the ferocious body hidden in the darkness. "It's just an advancement." At that moment, his true face was revealed under the reflection of the sea of blood. Chapter 152. At that moment, his true face was revealed under the reflection of the sea of blood. On the burly body covered in thick hair, in addition to Yu Jun's head, there were two other heads hidden on both sides. One of them was a ferocious banshee with countless snake hair, and the other was a sphinx that had disappeared without a trace. At this moment, there was not an inch of Lao Zhao's body that was originally his. No, it should be said that for a crowd-funded stigmata like the Stitched, there was no such thing as an original, right? But his current appearance was even more terrifying. It wasn't just Yin Yan's mystical iron boots, the Sphinx's head, and the snake-haired banshee's petrifying eyes. Behind him, there were also a few long, wriggling tails. They clearly had snake-like scales, but they had suckers that looked like octopus's tentacles. After a long period of hiding and collecting, Lao Shao had now gathered almost all the bodies of the passengers on the ship onto himself. It was hard to say whether it was ugly or ferocious. The crudely pieced together limbs gathered on his body, and they were integrated into one, without any trace of stitching. It looked so harmonious, as if they were born that way. He had completed his mission. He had successfully completed another sublimation and advanced from the original Stitched. This was his secret, the mission he had to complete. Otherwise, in the sea without strong preservatives and special anti-rejection drugs, the Stitch that was forcibly pieced together would not even live for a few days before it decayed and died. And now, he had successfully gotten rid of the shadow of death that was chasing after him. With the help of Jaga's magic potion and the countless limbs he had collected, he had completed the transformation and rebirth. Few people knew about the Stitched, a miracle that only appeared in modern times. In history, it was unknown how many of these incomplete and remote genealogies had quietly disappeared. Naturally, no one would know how incredible the advancement of a Stitched person was. Chimera. The moment he recognized this advancement, Huaisher widened his eyes in shock and disbelief. Or, to put it in a more precise and appropriate modern term, chimera. By definition, an organism is composed of cells of different genotypes. However, unlike the sutured corpses or flesh war chariots, and unlike the sutured humans who had to face the threat of decay and death, the chimeras were alive, and they were born this way, even if it was acquired. It had a variety of different characteristics, and simply and crudely gathered all the advantages into one. And this miracle of reuniting the many fragments into one was the true body of the chimera. Amidst the torrential rain of metal that could destroy any form of flesh and bones, old Shao laughed heartily and spread his arms as if he was taking a bath, welcoming the crazy firepower. After the Sphinx was eliminated by him, the pharaoh was killed by Lily, and then Koth was killed by Inyan's scheme. The last person who could become his enemy, Papaya, had rejected the god's attempts to fool her. She chose to commit suicide in her madness. On the other hand, he had already stepped over piles of corpses, completed his accumulation and breakthrough, and stepped into the fourth stage. Shingen. Even if the power of the soul didn't exist in this game, and he couldn't get the blessing of the soul perspective, he was now completely different from ordinary life forms. He wasn't afraid of the damage of any ordinary metal. At best, chemical-powered bullets were nothing more than an insignificant drizzle to him. Regardless of whether it was his extraordinary vitality, his strength and speed that were almost like those in horror stories, or the various abilities that he had stolen from others, they all allowed him to easily wipe out all of them. Now, there was no one who could be his opponent. Amidst the captain's roar, the rotating machine gun suddenly paused, and the ammunition chain was emptied. There was a momentary pause, and when everyone looked up again, Lao Shao had already disappeared from where he had been standing. He had disappeared. Not a sound was heard. Then, as if teleporting, the huge body appeared behind the captain. The captain roared and crushed his pipe. His muscles bulged as he turned around abruptly and punched the enemy behind him. However, that fist was easily wrapped up by a tentacle. Then, his other arm was crushed between the Sphinx's teeth. Then, the captain saw the head of the countless snake-haired, wriggling banshees. The captain roared and raised his head brazenly, crashing into the countless wriggling venomous snakes. He didn't care if his face was bitten to pieces, but his movements stopped halfway. As if frozen, a stone-like grayish-white color spread across his face and covered his entire body. In front of the banshee's eyes, he turned into an angry stone statue. F***CK, mother. At the last moment, the captain stood in front of Lily. Using all his strength, he raised his middle finger at old Shao. The next moment, the stone statue fell apart. In the scattered dust, the dried flowers that had lost their fragrance fell into the pool of blood on the ground, crushed into mud, and disappeared without a trace. However, right after that, another cyborg picked up the axe left behind by Huaisher and rushed toward old Shao. With all his strength, he chopped down on the snake-haired banshee's face. Several crew members pounced from behind and hugged old Zhao's arms and legs tightly. Someone stuffed the fallen Gatling into the Sphinx's open mouth, propping up the sharp fangs. In the next moment, they were torn to pieces. It was as easy as crushing dry weeds and smashing rotten wood. It was like tearing a thin piece of paper. But when his broken body landed on the ground, the unconscious cyborgs still used the last of their strength to pull at his hind legs and open their mouths, trying to leave a deep bite mark on the layer of scales. In the end, old Shao raised his foot and stomped down. In the roar, the crew's ship shook. Blazing flames and acid spewed out from his two mouths respectively, burning the burden hanging on his body to ashes. However, even more people rushed up and blocked his path. Old Shao roared and roared. Against the countless people pulling at him, he charged forward angrily and crushed all the bugs in front of him. But when he looked up again, he could no longer find Lily and Huaisher. They had escaped, but this was above the vast sea. They had no way to escape. Go forward, turn right, and climb up the ladder directly. Panting, the first mate shoved a blood-stained key into Lily's hand. There's a lifeboat hidden in the dust-proof cloth below the rear deck. You can take it and leave this place. The second mate will take you there. What about you? Come with us. Lily reached out to pull him back, but he took a step back. There was a smug expression on his burned face. No, I have my job. As long as you can survive, it's fine. He stared at the girl in front of him, slowly stepped back, and solemnly said goodbye. You have to survive and replace us. Heavy footsteps could be heard in the corridor behind them. At the last moment, the first mate looked back at the girl in the distance, smiled, and waved goodbye. The gate was closed. His roar came from behind the door. Then there was no more sound. Lily did not dare to look again. She suppressed the urge to cry and ran forward. Broken cyborgs constantly bid farewell to the team and stayed behind. They disappeared amidst the shouts and roars. In the end, the second mate, who was gasping for breath, gently put Huaisher on his back on the ground and smiled at her. I'll send you here. The thin young man hesitated for a moment and asked softly, Miss, can you hug me? Lily resisted the urge to cry and nodded vigorously. It's good. This is the taste of life. The cyborg whispered softly, gently loosened his arm, took a step back, and smiled gratefully. Live, miss. Please live. This was the final goodbye. He turned around, smashed the glass cabinet next to him, pulled out a fire axe, shouted, and rushed into the cabin behind him. Lily could not hold back her tears anymore. She choked, reached out, picked up Huaisher on the ground, and walked step by step to the lifeboat hanging behind. But as she walked, she felt that Huaisher's breathing was getting weaker and weaker. After his pulse disappeared, his heartbeat also stopped. His breathing stopped. Huaisher, can you hear me? She shook the vampire's shoulder in fear, but there was no response. Huaisher lowered his head, and the fragments peeled off from his broken face. Not a sound was heard. Are you going to die too? The girl finally understood. She wanted to cry, but she didn't even have the strength to cry. Why do you have to die too? Say something. She knelt on the ground in a sorry state, futilely sprinkling all the potions on Huaisher's body, and weakly begged, Are you bothering me again, Huaisher? Aren't we friends? I beg you to say something, please, please. In the dim and broken dream, Huaisher seemed to be falling into a dark abyss, endlessly downward. He felt that he might die. No, he was definitely going to die. The kind that was certain death. Ai Ching, are you there? He called softly, but there was no response. It was as if the distance was too far, and he couldn't even feel the existence of Ai Ching. Maybe the signal here wasn't very good, but that didn't matter anymore. In the deep drowsiness, everything became unimportant. He closed his eyes and let the cold of death engulf him little by little like a tide. It seemed that he had forgotten something important. There seemed to be the sound of burning and breaking. It seemed that someone was calling him, but he couldn't hear it clearly. He tried in vain to open his eyes, using all his strength. Then he saw the burning sailboat, the dark sky, and the sea as quiet as blood. The endless sea seemed to cover everything, just like death. The new world was still out of reach. For example, hope, relief, redemption. All the beautiful things were too far away. It was always sad. He stared blankly at the crying girl. His lips opened and closed with difficulty, but he couldn't make a sound. Unfortunately, no one can save you. He wanted to say, I'm sorry. Don't leave me alone. I beg you. In the dizziness, Huaisher heard the girl's desperate words. Please live. Then it was as if sweet dew had fallen on his dry lips. It was like a miracle rain. Chapter 153. It was as if time had stopped for an instant. Golden rain flowed down from the girl's wrist and fell into Huaisher's mouth. Between the dark and cruel world, that line of bright gold was like a miracle, so gorgeous that it was intoxicating. At this moment, with the loss of blood, endless vitality comparable to the philosopher's stone flowed out from it. It was a terrifying amount that could create an android legion with just a few grams. Now, with Lily's generous water, 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times, sprinkled down. At all costs. Even if it was to put out the fire, even if it was futile. She persistently continued Huai-Shir's last line of vitality. It was like a lonely hand pulling at him, not allowing him to leave without permission. Please live. Lily shed tears and smiled at him awkwardly. Stay. Don't be the only one left, please. In his dizziness and pain, Huai-Shir raised his hand with difficulty, wanting to touch her cheek. He felt the tears falling on his fingertips, so cold. The raised palm stopped abruptly in the air. In the end, it fell weakly to the ground. Only the sound of something breaking could be heard. No matter how generous the fountain of life was, no matter how Lily cried out in distress. There was no longer any light in his empty eyes, only reflecting the dark sky and the blood-like sea, reflecting this cruel world. There was no more sound. Lily stared at him blankly, unable to believe it. For a long, long time, she let out a hoarse cry, but no one responded. Heavy footsteps stopped in front of her. There was a line of footprints with blood. Is he already dead? Old Shao murmured regretfully, sighed, and slowly raised his 5 beastly fingers, aiming at Lily's face. I'm sorry, I had to do this, although this is just a game. At that moment, 5 fingers as sharp as knives were raised and stabbed at the sluggish girl. A shrill sound broke through the air, like a scream. Then, the screams came to an abrupt stop in front of cracked palm. His wrist was clenched tightly. After countless fragments of the broken palm peeled off, silver-white bones were exposed. It was as if the gate of hell had been suddenly opened. From the empty eyes, there was a surging bloodlight. You're not allowed. The dead vampire slowly raised its head. Amidst the sound of countless pieces of flesh peeling off, the broken face revealed a skeleton that seemed to be made of metal. It was so ferocious. It was clearly an empty shell that had already lost its soul, but under the push of the remnant stubbornness, the shattered vampire actually crawled up from the ground once more, blocking in front of the chimera. His hoarse voice sounded like metal roaring as he enunciated each word clearly to the enemy before him. You're not allowed to touch her. In his dizziness, Huai-Shir felt that he had once again fallen into the abyss. Holy light shone from the sky, carrying endless majesty and solemnity. It indifferently stared at his sorry state, watching him kneel before the altar. This is your last chance, Abraham, and the last mercy of the Holy Spirit. The old bishop looked down at him coldly. Holding the scepter in his hand, he gave his last order, Abraham, kill her, and you will still be saved. In the silence, only Huai-Shir's pained moans could be heard. He gasped for breath with difficulty, crawling forward in a sorry state. He stretched out his trembling hand, as if he wanted to grasp the light of nothingness and salvation. But until the end, he did not speak. Trash, you disappoint me. The bishop's face twitched and gradually turned ashen. Since you don't repent, then you and that heretic can drown in God's fury. Without a shred of sympathy, he turned and left, abandoning Huai-Shir in the darkness. But immediately after, he felt a palm pressing on his shoulder. A hoarse voice sounded from behind him. Close a hand. I'm sorry, Father. Unknowingly, Huai-Shir had already crawled up from the ground. He lowered his head, staring at the neck that was close at hand, and said softly, Others didn't give it to me. I prefer to take it myself. At that moment, the old bishop let out a sharp scream. The vampire's fangs were already deeply nailed into his neck, frantically extracting his blood. He sucked in big mouthfuls, wantonly gorging like a hungry dog. No matter how hard he struggled, begged, or angrily rebuked. Until the end, there was no more sound. In the dead silence, Huai-Shir slowly opened his mouth. Then, the shriveled corpse fell on the altar. Huai-Shir lowered his head and stared at the terrified face of death. He slowly raised his hand and wiped away the last trace of sweet blood at the corner of his mouth. Then, he bent down and took the scepter from his hand. Now, does anyone else have an order for me? The young man raised his head and stared at the holy light above the vault of heaven. In the dead silence, no one spoke. So, facing the cold gazes of the gods, the rebellious vampire slowly raised the scepter in his hand and smiled happily. Isn't it just salvation? I have it. At that moment, the holy light dissipated. The abyss collapsed. Huaishur opened his eyes and saw the pitch-black vault of heaven and the endless sea of blood. He had returned to this gloomy vault of heaven, even if he was already shattered and only bones were left. He slowly turned his head and stared at the startled girl behind him. A smile appeared on his broken face. "I'll fight for you, my lady." Boom! The chimera's tentacles swept across. Huaishur flew backwards and smashed into the mast, completely breaking it. The broken sails fell into the burning flames and burned fiercely. From the flames, the broken Huaishur crawled up like a clay doll. He lowered his head and looked at his tragic state, then raised his hand towards old Shaw, who was slowly walking over. "Wait a minute. Let me flip through the book. We'll fight after I flip through it." He waved his hand and pulled out the Book of Destiny. He pathetically flipped through the records left behind by the bishop, looking for records in the fragmented handwriting. But old Shaw did not give him any chance. He stretched out his hand, and two tentacles flew out from his sleeves and wrapped around Huaishur's legs. He was pulled into the air and then slammed onto the deck. It was as if he was holding a hammer. All the cabins within sight were smashed into pieces. Countless fragments flew everywhere. In the end, only a silver-white skeleton was left in the ruins. Strands of golden blood flowed on the silver skeleton, slowly shining with light, as if it was embellished with an array of steel. He was actually still alive? Old Shaw frowned unhappily. The two heads on his shoulders suddenly opened and spewed acid and poisonous fire. They gathered into a tide and swept straight towards Huaishur. "So that's how it is?" At that moment, the broken skeleton nodded in understanding. He stretched out his hand and pulled out the solemn scepter from the Book of Destiny. He slowly raised its sharp end. He aimed it at his own chest. Stab down. Boom! The flames engulfed everything. But then, from the terrifying temperature that was enough to melt steel into liquid, a holy light shone from the remains of the vampire. It was as if it had turned into the sun in an instant. Endless fierce light spewed out from Huaishur's chest. It came from the scepter. It was purification. Huaishur was actually purifying himself. The holy light that was 100 times more powerful than holy water was coldly spreading over Huaishur's body. Inch by inch, it killed the vampire's dark substance and body. Old Shaw did not even need to do anything. He was simply committing suicide. But in this cold purification that did not leave any trace, Huaishur opened his hand happily and welcomed the arrival of the end. Deliberately mystifying, old Shaw snorted coldly. In an instant, a violent wind was stirred up. He raised his fist and punched towards Huaishur's broken head. At that moment, Huaishur raised his palm. The finger bone that was bathed in the holy flame was shining brightly. It slowly unfolded and blocked the front of the beast fist. Boom! The storm, the tide, and the loud noise came to an abrupt halt in front of this palm in an instant. Old Shaw raised his head in shock. He heard the sound of steel rubbing against Huaishur's broken face. There seemed to be a seed of iron growing in that ferocious skull. It grew inch by inch from the broken skull and covered the ferocious face of the skull, turning into a solemn and cold mask. Behind the mask, a light suddenly lit up in the pair of pitch-black eye sockets. Huaishur opened his mouth, shouted, and roared. The silent sound was given substance. The blazing light turned into a torrent, gushing out from his eyes and mouth. It went straight forward and instantly pierced through Old Shaw's arm, burning that mutated arm into ashes. The scepter cracked inch by inch. At the moment when all the vampire parts were burned, a bright glow flowed out from Huaishur's remaining silver bones, covering his skeleton and turning into a brand new body. In the light, the power of countless holy spirits riveted, connected, woven, and entangled with each other. It was as if there was a substantial light flowing on the remaining skeleton, no, on the holy bones. In an instant, a new miracle emerged from the void. As Huaishur moved forward, countless golden lines appeared on the silver mask above his head. In the void, a pure light opened up and intertwined into a ring. It hung high and scattered a cold and stern light in all directions. When he took the first step, The matrix of steel and the holy bones of iron all over his body cried. Countless tiny sounds overlapped with each other and turned into a grand song. It was so holy. When he took the second step, a cracking sound came from his back. It was the sound of old bones breaking, and also the clear cry of a new miracle being born. With a sharp sound, sparks flew. Branches of iron rose from his back inch by inch. On the countless veins, light condensed into fine hairs, forming a pair of wings so large that they seemed to be able to stand above the sky. Wings of steel. It was as if the legendary holy spirits were walking between heaven and earth, delivering punishment and destruction. I heard you advance. Between the dark sky and the blood-red sea, the angel of steel stood between this cruel world. He looked down at the stunned chimera, and the corners of his mouth curled up in a smile behind the mask. What a coincidence, me too. Using 100 times more sins to temper a person's soul, injecting the miracle of the Holy Spirits into the silver and implanting it into the bone marrow. Then, using the blood of countless people to irrigate and nurture it, planting the seed of salvation in the abyss of depravity. When the infinite darkness burned out, light would spurt out from the abyss. When the original sin was purified, salvation would come. This was the salvation that Van Helsing yearned for, the advancement of vampires, angel of might. Fleischer raised his palm and clenched it in the direction of the burning sailboat below. An invisible gravitational force burst forth, and the sound of steel rang. The blood-stained silver axe whistled and fell into his hand, towards the angry chimera. Slash. Chapter 154. Boom! In the blink of an eye, the chimera flew backward, plowing 2 deep fissures in the deck. Elder Shao stood firm and roared. Dozens of tentacles shot out from his body and shot towards Fleischer, who was in midair. The speed was unbelievably fast, but in the eyes of the Angel of Karma, it was surprisingly slow. Fleischer moved forward an inch. The air was torn apart by the steel body, bursting with roaring air waves. The white impact swept out and flattened the surrounding wreckage in an instant. He felt as if he had become a supersonic fighter jet. If he wanted it, he could go all out. From stillness to movement in a short instant, he reached a speed of about Mach 3. In front of such a huge speed, even the overly desolate sea and sky became narrow. Such a short gap was almost instantaneous. Like a shooting star, he descended from the sky and jumped between the countless entangling tentacles. The burning axe blade drew a sharp trace in the air. Wherever it passed, all the tentacles were shattered. Blood splattered and was immediately vaporized. And Fleischer was already close at hand. He aimed at the chimera in front of him and punched. Under the wind pressure, the mutated limbs rippled like water. When the fist arrived with a terrifying air wave and blazing temperature, the flesh and blood fell apart, revealing a pitch-black skeleton. Cracks appeared on the skeleton, but then it was repaired. Before the disintegrated flesh and blood could evaporate, new flesh and blood emerged from the wound. This time it had evolved. The hard chitin skeleton pierced out of the body and covered old Zhao's body. Then, as the flesh and blood wriggled, it quickly formed a buffer layer between the exoskeleton and the internal organs. In an instant, it was unrecognizable. The only thing left was a giant wrapped in pitch-black bones. This was the Chimera, a rank 4 sublimator that could absolutely adapt to any environment, any battle, and any place. With such an excessive genetic reserve, old Zhao could obtain the characteristics of any dark creature at any time and strengthen it. There was even a pair of bone wings slowly growing on his back. Soon, the flesh and blood multiplied, turning into bat-like wings covered in scales. After breaking free from the limitations of gravity, he grinned at Fleischer. The head of the Banshees on his right shoulder suddenly opened her eyes and stared at Fleischer. But her gaze only had time to leave 2 lime-like dots on the back of Fleischer's raised axe. In the next moment, Fleischer disappeared on the spot. Then, he appeared behind him. Old Zhao turned around in shock. Then he saw Huaishi's unfurled steel wings and her blade-like wings. He also saw the 16 flaming swords shooting out of her nostrils in a hurricane. What's the use of having wings? Are you stupid? This is my holy light jet engine. Even Huaishi himself did not King expect that the wings of the Angel of Authority had vectoring nozzles for acceleration. But when he thought about it, dozens of steel feathers suddenly fell off from his back, drawing dozens of complicated arcs in the air. With blazing light, they bombarded the Chimera's body. In an instant, the bat wings were torn apart and riddled with holes. Under the bombardment of the metal feathers, several bloody holes appeared on the hard exoskeleton. The steel feathers that slowly opened up like tree branches were deeply wedged into the flesh. As they were pulled out, they brought with them a bloody whirl. It was incomparably ferocious. There are missiles too? Huaishi was stunned. Is this a King Angel of Authority or a holy light fighter? After a moment of astonishment, he abruptly retreated, increasing the distance between them. His steel wings unfurled, and flames suddenly burst forth between the sky and the sea. Hundreds of blazing rays of light gushed out from within, and the steel wings flew into the sky, whistling as they shot out, bringing with them streaks of sharp marks. They intersected with each other and turned into a storm, instantly sweeping towards the Chimera. Countless rays of light intersected in this metal storm. The surface of the sharp iron pieces was so smooth, like a mirror reflecting the bright light. From afar, it looked like a whirling hurricane of light and iron. In just an instant, the Chimera was cut into pieces. Blood spurted out and dyed the steel crimson red. The steel feathers sank deep into the bones all over his body, causing him to roar in pain. His flesh was badly mutilated. Huaishi's face also turned pale, and he felt weak. The light was like his blood. At this moment, he was also in a state of bleeding. In a moment of carelessness, he almost forgot that his Angel of Authority was a pirated version. The so-called punishment for breaking an oath now seemed to be part of the sublimation. How ironic. Van Helsing probably never dreamed that the redemption he had been bitterly seeking was hidden in his body by the church. In the punishment, he was incomparably resistant to and fearful of, casting a sharp light with thousands of times the darkness, and then washing away the darkness with a thunderous method to reforge a sharp blade. In the Holy Spirit lineage, the convenience of the vampire as a tool did not lie in its outstanding ability as an executioner, but also in its own cruel tempering and unimaginable soul torture. Only in this way could the most perfect fighting machine be tempered from the depths of the darkness. Angel of Authority. The so-called punishment for breaking an oath was a sublimation mechanism buried in the vampire's body in advance. When the cardinals believed that a sinner had redeemed his sins and could be redeemed, or that the sinner was too useless to be destroyed, this mechanism would be activated from the inside out, quickly burning the vampire to ashes. The difference was that the consciousness of the one being redeemed would be maintained under the grace of the Holy Spirit and survive the purest burning stage. Then, under the grace of the Holy Spirit, they would rise in rank and become a fearless member of the Holy Spirit army, a saint and angel walking in the mortal world. For Huaishi, except for the punishment for breaking an oath, the other two steps were all wrong. One was maintained by Lily with her own miracle blood, and the other came from the scepter he had obtained as a traitor by backstabbing the bishop. There was no activation code for either. This kind of self-modified illegal car had to avoid the traffic police on the road, let alone replenishing fuel at the official gas station. In other words, the fuel tank was only so big and there was only so much fuel. He had to drive leisurely. Fortunately, he at least had some experience in driving an illegal modified car. Even if he could not catch anyone, he could still drive slowly back and forth on Akina Mountain. It was a pity that such a cool flying tool could only make people feel good for a while. Huaishi regretfully shook his head and sighed. On the steel wings, the light that had been gradually dimming was reinvigorated and forcibly lit up. The burning flames set off a terrifying airflow, propelling him towards the incomplete chimera. In the air, the shining axe blade was rubbed red by the high-speed airflow, bursting with a burning glow. Boom! The steel wings crisscrossed past, dragging the axe blade as they chiseled a huge hole in the chimera's body. Yu Jun's head flew high into the air, burning into a lump of charcoal as the wings swept past. Then, in midair, the flames spurting out from Huai Shi's left wing suddenly weakened, while the flames from his right wing surged. As if being pulled by an invisible rope, it drew a dangerous arc along an axis of nothingness. After completing an almost exaggerated sharp turn, blazing flames once again emerged from the vector nozzle, and waves of air gushed out. Huai Shi turned back. Slash! This time, the chimera roared, raising its mangled left arm and smashing it toward Huai Shi. Relying on its prediction of the trajectory, it launched an attack at a distance that Huai Shi would not be able to dodge. In an instant, Huai Shi's pupils dilated. Seeing the black shadow smashing towards his face, he subconsciously turned around in the air. Under the terrifying speed, the ailerons on his wings were raised to the limit, and the 16 vector nozzles quickly changed direction. The hurricane suddenly shook, pulling his body into a rapid spin in the air. Barrel roll maneuver. The tip of his nose almost brushed against the chimera's sweeping arm. Huai Shi and Old Xiao passed by each other. The steel wings cut a deep crack in the black exoskeleton, but cracks also appeared on the wings. The chimera's blood spurted out, and in the midst of the flying blood, countless things that looked like grass seeds suddenly flew into the hurricane, being pulled into the wings by the violent airflow. They instantly expanded, spreading and growing wildly like vines. Even if they were instantly burned by the terrifying temperature, the remaining ashes blocked a few of the vector nozzles. The flames stagnated. In the air, Huai Shi's movements shook. Then, he heard the sound of something breaking through the air behind him. Old Zhao's left arm had been raised in front of him at some point. In the palm of his hand, a sharp bone slowly appeared like a harpoon. Then his left arm exploded with a loud bang. At the last moment, Huai Shi saw his arm harden in an instant, as if it had turned into a cannon barrel. From the bottom, blazing flames appeared. The air instantly expanded, pushing the harpoon-like bone and pulling the rope of flesh towards him. Using a harpoon to hit an airplane? Only you could think of that. In the instant of the collision, Huai Shi's left wing was pierced by the harpoon, and the barb instantly latched onto it. Then, the contracting rope of flesh pulled the chimera into the air. Fresh meat. As if it had heard the butcher's roar, a black shadow rushed up. It first threw a butcher's mark, then an E-smash, followed by a tendon break. Huai Shi's vision instantly turned black. The chimera's knife-like arm had already pierced through his chest, but there was no blood spurting out from the wound. Only a ray of light leaked out. Looking at the sinister smile that was close at hand, Huai Shi gritted his teeth, raised his hand, and swung the axe at the chimera's head. You've been cut into pieces, and you still dare to play the butcher. Huai Shi was unable to dodge in midair, so she swung her axe down. More than half of the banshee's head was chopped off. The eyes of petrification, the most threatening part of the banshee's head, as well as the disgusting snake hair, were all chopped off and fell into the blood-red sea below. Huai Shi suddenly pulled up the wing. After burning the rope of blood, he threw away the harpoon and began to soar madly upwards, trying to throw the chimera off. But the moment it pounced over, the two tentacles at Lao Zhao's tail had already wrapped tightly around his body. It was as if they had been tied together, and they refused to let go. Instead, they took the opportunity to attack Huai Shi fiercely. The Sphinx's teeth suddenly opened and bit down on his neck. Bang! The metal teeth and the axe blade collided, and sparks flew. Huai Shi sneered. Fine, you want me to carry you, right? Let's plan a Mammon maneuver first. Chapter 155. Between the sea and the sky, the angel spewed out a dazzling golden flash as he galloped madly without any pattern. The angel began to go all out, leaving behind a series of loud explosions. In the long flight, he actually accelerated again. After breaking through Mach 5, the hurricane that rushed at him seemed to have become knives. Sometimes he went up, sometimes he went down, and sometimes he circled or landed without any pattern. Dazzling tactical maneuvers were performed here, but he couldn't get rid of the bastard that stuck to him. He was tightly wrapped around Huaishi's body, and he kept catalyzing all kinds of messy organs to attack Huaishi. In the rapid flight, Huaishi actually couldn't suppress his strange attacks that didn't have any pattern. In an instant, there were several holes in his body. The Holy Spirit system was really stingy. They gave him fighter jets, but they weren't willing to give him missiles. If he had a sulfur bow in hand and a few salt arrows, this bastard's head would explode from hundreds of miles away. There wouldn't be so much trouble. I've already leveled up. Why won't you just obediently die? Huaishi suddenly did a barrel roll, throwing old Xiao in a big circle in the air. But right after that, the Chimera once again rushed up with its tentacles, and its beastly claws and sharp limbs slashed wildly at Huaishi. Sparks of steel kept flying. Huaishi's upward climb finally reached the peak, and he was only a short distance away from the pitch-black clouds. Intuition told him that there was an indescribably terrifying and crazy power hidden behind the clouds. If he rushed in, he definitely wouldn't have a good ending. So his speed suddenly slowed, and he began to fall. And at that moment, he heard old Zhao's cold laughter. "Guess," he said softly. "Why hasn't your inspector said anything yet?" Huaishi was stunned, and then he awkwardly blocked an attack from a tricky angle. "She's about to die, Huaishi." The Chimera laughed proudly. "This is all thanks to you. I'm afraid she's already dead, right? I haven't gone over to take a look, but the way he died is really quite tragic." Huaishi's eyes widened in shock, and he was in a trance for a moment. His facial armor was suddenly cut open by the beast's claw, and his neck was almost bitten off by the Sphinx. "Are you stupid?" AI Ching's hoarse voice rang in his ears, weak and soft. "Are you a pig? Do you believe everything he says? Are you all right?" Huaishi was overjoyed, but then he was puzzled. "What's wrong with your voice? Why do you care so much?" AI Ching raised her voice with anger that came out of nowhere. "Just don't listen to his nonsense. Are you here to chat with him?" In the midst of another collision, countless sparks flew. Huaishi opened his mouth and took a deep breath. Countless rays of light surged from his mouth. Old Xiao was stunned and subconsciously raised his arm to block in front of him, guarding against the flame that might be spat out next. But then he saw a trace of mockery in Huaishi's shining eye sockets. Then everything went black. It was as if they had jumped from the 19th floor and hit a marble slab, and they instantly felt the pain and impact of their whole body turning into mud. They had already hit the surface of the sea. Falling from a height of hundreds of meters, the surface of the water was no longer the level of marble, but the hardness of the lazurite fortress. No matter how terrifying their vitality was, under such an impact, they would be severely damaged. But Huaishi was far more relaxed than him. At the moment of impact, he retracted his wings and hid behind old Xiao, using his former teammate as a buffer. Even though he was knocked out of his senses and his entire body was wailing from the impact, he still looked unscathed. Unlike old Xiao, who had turned into a pile of rotten meat. They bounced on the surface of the water, but then Huaishi forced his wings to move in the midst of pain and dizziness. Flames erupted, taking them up again down. Just like that, in the roar of the sea surface breaking, they rushed into the bloody deep sea. It was as if they had jumped into a pool of sulfuric acid in an instant. Even the angel of authority, who was now no longer human, felt waves of intense pain from the corrosive origin substance. Soaked in the sea water, his steel wings and body were rapidly rusting and disintegrating. What frightened him even more was that the twisted black shadows swimming in the deep sea were ferociously disturbing his countless limbs. Sensing this bit of fire, thousands of tentacles wrapped around him. Huaishi only felt a bone-piercing chill. The vector nozzle suddenly changed direction and rose up. In an instant, it broke out of the sea. But to his regret, even after suffering such heavy injuries, Old Shao still did not let go of his hand and held on tightly to his wings. Then, he pulled with all his might. Boom! Huaishi's left wing was pulled with all his strength, and the flames instantly dimmed. Then, a tragic crack appeared. Ignoring Huaishi's axe that was chopping down, Old Shao pulled again. A steel wing covered in rust left Huaishi's body amidst the intense pain. Their flight instantly swayed, and they staggered in midair, turned around, rose, and fell. Finally, in a violent tumble, they smashed crookedly into the body of the ship, which was covered in cracks. Amidst the rumbling, the Chimera was finally thrown down and smashed to the ground. Huaishi staggered and rolled on top of the wreckage. He lay on the ground, panting with difficulty. Suddenly, he felt that he could not breathe. Huaishi opened his mouth and suddenly vomited a mouthful of blood. He stared at the bloodstains on his hand in astonishment. Now, he should have already become an angel of authority after metal and energy. What surged in his body was light. How could there be blood? When he lowered his head, he saw the bone dagger pierced into his chest. The dagger was hollow. As it ruptured, strands of black sludge were slowly released. They spread out amidst the surging light like a spiderweb, spreading across Huaishi's chest. It was so familiar. Was that Kush's origin substance? When he was still a vampire, even though he could sense the evil intent surging within it, he had never personally experienced its polluting properties. No matter what, they were all on the same side of the dark creatures. And after he had transformed into an angel of authority, Kush's remaining origin substance displayed a terrifying infectious ability. It was like a nail stuck in his body, obstructing him from within. For a moment, Huaishi actually felt dizzy, as if he had a high fever. He struggled to pull the dagger out of his chest, then raised his hand and used the red-hot axe to burn away the sludge flowing from his chest. Unfortunately, the poison still remained in his body. Panting, the angel of authority crawled up from the ground and stared at the Chimera slowly walking out of the rubble. You could even predict this? I told you, Huaishi. Old Shao opened his mouth and spat out a metal weapon from his tail. It was covered in thick glue and a large amount of gastric acid. I made a lot of preparations. After all, KP was on my side from the very beginning. Ha 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 ha! As he laughed proudly, he reached out and tore off the glue on the weapon, revealing an ancient weapon that glowed with traces of copper green. It was a curved sickle. On the blade of the sword, there were still remnants of a golden insignia. It was the open eye of Horus, the last legacy of that useless pharaoh. You're so heartless. Huaishi sneered indifferently, once again pulling up his heavy silver axe from the ground. I just can't carry you, and you're so arrogant, my friend. Although he only had one wing left, he cannot fly. But if it was just a simple acceleration, he could still do it for the time being. In the blink of an eye, the wooden deck under Huaishi's feet cracked. In the flames of the Vector Sphinx, the last camouflage covering the cruise ship was torn apart, revealing the true appearance of the masts and sailboats riddled with holes. The last of the hanging canvas was torn by the Angel of Heaven's advance. The steel angel broke through the air. Slash! Sword and axe collided, but immediately after, Huaishi pulled out a short knife from behind him and mercilessly stabbed it into the Sphinx's open mouth. Blood splattered everywhere. On the sickle, the runes of the Eye of Horus suddenly trembled. The bronze sickle seemed to lose its physical form in an instant and turned into a gap in the void. From the gap, in the endless light and heat, the eagle-headed god cast an indifferent glance at the mortal world. It was just a glance. Then, he withdrew his gaze without interest. Huaishi felt as if he had been struck by lightning. His vision turned black, and he was almost unable to maintain the state of the angel of authority. When the fake oracle encountered the real divine power, it was lucky that he did not explode on the spot. In his momentary weakness, the Sphinx suddenly opened his mouth, crushed the short knife in his mouth, and bit down on Sui Xiong's neck. In an instant, the sharp sound of steel rubbing against each other burst forth. Under the closed teeth, the iron armor of the angel of authority cracked, and a dim light lit up from it, as if blood was flowing out. Just as the Sphinx was about to bite off Sui Xiong's neck completely, Huaishir suddenly asked softly, "What is the name of Dad's father?" The Sphinx was stunned. He seemed to be deep in thought. No matter how distant the bloodline was from the ancestor, and how weak his own strength was compared to the original, no matter which Sphinx it could not resist the temptation of puzzles. This was instinct. Even in some history, there were many learned Sphinx who would accompany the pharaoh as sages and make incisive suggestions for his national politics. Unfortunately, for today's idiots who only had their heads left, it took a long time to think about such a simple question. When Sui Xiong forcibly controlled it, it was already a beat too late. The axe in Huaishir's hand had already drawn an arc behind him, and with a twist of his wrist, it slammed into the Sphinx's face. The crack was deep, and blood gushed out. The scythe shook again, but this time Huaishir let go of the axe and clenched his fists. The genuine iron fists burst forth with a sound of steel, and as Huaishir waved them out, there was a roar. "Eat my Babylonian iron fist." The silver axe did not fall to the ground. A left hook, a right hook, and an uppercut. After executing a full set of Roman martial arts moves, and with the flames spurting out from his wings, a holy iron fist smashed into Old Zhao's face. Old Zhao's neck whimpered, and the faint sound of his skull cracking could be heard. Huaishir had already caught the axe falling from the air and swept it across, blocking the delayed light on the blade. The eye of Horus opened, and then saw nothing, so he closed his eyes again. Huaishir had already moved forward, his footsteps shattering the deck, and his shoulders slammed forward, knocking the chimera back a step. He raised the silver axe, and holy light burst forth. Then he slashed at the Sphinx's head. Chapter 156. Cracks spread from the silver axe and the scythe amidst the roar of the collision. The broken axe blade flew out, and the eye of Horus on the scythe also shattered. In that instant, Old Zhao roared. The two of them threw away the broken weapons in their hands at the same time, raised their fists again, and slammed them together. Amidst the chimera's roar, Huaishir abruptly dodged the fist that was sweeping towards her. Then, she raised her 5 fingers and jabbed at the chimera's throat, blocking the roar back down. Then, as his wrist contracted, his 5 fingers suddenly clenched into a fist. He charged forward again, smashing the Sphinx's head with a roar. This was the straw that broke the camel's back. This time, the fragile skull could no longer withstand the bombardment of this punch. It shattered with a dull sound, and the last head was about to be destroyed. But right after that, Huaishir suddenly trembled and bent over involuntarily. She saw the chimera's long tail smashing into her abdomen like a hammer. It was almost as if the chimera's tail was trying to break through steel, causing cracks to spread. He staggered backward and gasped for breath. Then, he and Old Zhao pounced forward at the same time. The battle began again. This time, it was no longer a battle between swords and sabers and flying between the sea and the sky, but a face-to-face battle. After discarding all the irrelevant elements, they returned to the realm of beasts. Bones were broken, blood was washed. Every time they collided, stomped their feet, and punched, there would be a roar. The wailing sailboat was constantly shaking and cracking, and thick smoke rose from the burning flames. The ashes fell on the broken armor of the Angel of Authority, and the light in Huaishir's eyes gradually flickered and dimmed. In the violent battle, the endless power seemed to have been squandered away, and it was difficult to resist the fierce poison of the dark elemental substance. Under the armor, he gradually recovered the senses of flesh and blood. He felt the tearing pain, as well as dizziness and fatigue. But the other side was not much better. The 2 eyesore tails had been completely torn off by Huaishir, and the last head of the Sphinx had been smashed to pieces by Huaishir. Punches, punches, and punches again. Amidst the rumbling sounds, the Archangel of Power was like a machine that did not know fatigue, forcefully shaking the chimera's torrential winds and torrential rains, before using violence to counter violence with an iron fist. Amidst the dull sound, the exoskeleton in front of the chimera's chest was completely shattered, revealing the devastation within. Old Xiao staggered and took a step back. However, Huaishur continued to advance. Once again, he raised his fist and smashed out. Bang! Come on! Huaishur roared and stepped forward, pressing forward step by step. He waved his hand to wipe away the blood on the back of his hand and clenched it again. The sound of steel rubbing against each other was so ferocious. Haven't you made a lot of preparations? Take it out, Old Xiao. Let's see how you can win. Ha 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 ha. The chimera seemed to be amused by Huaishur's words. It clutched its stomach and laughed, unable to contain its joy. Even if Huaishur pulled him up and punched him again and again, smashing him into the ruins of the bridge. You really bang? He suddenly reached out and grabbed Huaishur's iron fist. He slowly clenched his fist and smiled savagely. You don't know anything. A loud explosion rang out. As the beast's arms danced, Huaishur was pulled into the air. He smashed through the floorboards and fell into the lower level of the cabin. Immediately afterwards, however, the chimera raised its foot and stomped down on his face. Huaishur rolled, dodged, and crawled to his feet, panting violently. He felt waves of dizziness, and his vision darkened. However, what made him uneasy was Ai Qing's silence and the burning pain in his skull. This was the punishment for breaking his oath. Even though the chains on his body had been shattered, the principles and commandments of the origin substance still existed. At this moment, as he weakened, they appeared once again, tormenting his soul. Like cold steel, they struck him again and again, shaking his consciousness and causing his vision to darken. Guess, Huaishur? Old Xiao roared and swung his fist, sending him flying. Guess why Yaka went crazy? Huaishur retreated, his feet leaving 2 deep marks on the broken deck. Guess. He roared angrily again. When Ko Sish felt that he was about to die, he went crazy and tried to kill an entire ship of people. Boom. Huaishur was smashed into the wall. Guess again why? The more people die on this ship, the faster it will die. He laughed savagely, then raised his foot and kicked forward. A terrifying force burst forth, causing Huaishur to break through several layers of the cabin's floorboards and be wedged into the wall. Finally, guess, he slowly bent down and picked up Huaishur's broken axe from the ground. He staggered forward with a malicious and ferocious smile on his face. It's only been a night's journey, but why haven't we seen the so-called New World yet? Old Xiao looked down at Huaishur's broken face and shook his head in disappointment. He slowly raised the axe and swung it down. The blade of the axe stopped abruptly in front of Huaishur's eyes. The end of the handle was suddenly grasped by a hand, unable to move an inch forward. You're using my axe to chop me? Huaishur slowly raised his head and stared at the hideous face. Who gave you the confidence? The sound of steel rubbing against each other burst forth. The blade of the axe retreated. Upwards. It moved away inch by inch between Huaishur's raised fingers. In his dizziness and pain, Huaishur roared. He suddenly raised his hand, clenched it, and smashed it into Old Xiao's face. Then, he punched again and again, until that broken face was smashed into a bloody mess by him. Finally, he clenched his fist with all his might. He swung it. With a roar, the chimera flew out. After smashing through the cabin, it landed on the deck, which was riddled with holes, and fell into the flames. Huaishur gasped for breath as she crawled up from the ground. Dragging her axe, she climbed up step by step and crawled out. In the end, he saw the enemy lying on the ground. It seemed that he had no strength left. He leaned against the broken rail and opened his eyes with difficulty. He looked at Huaishur, who was walking towards him step by step. For some reason, he couldn't help but laugh hoarsely. Did you think of a joke? Huaishur asked indifferently. Why don't you say it so that everyone can listen to it? Isn't the one in front of me a joke? Old Xiao panted and smiled mockingly at him. How ironic, Huaishur. It was destined from the beginning. Only you can't win. Ha ha, he said. You can kill me, but you can't escape that curse. In his dizziness, Huaishur felt a sharp pain in his head. He staggered and gritted his teeth angrily. He stepped forward and asked hoarsely, A ridiculous joke? Are these your last words? Is that so? Old Xiao raised his head and spat out a mouthful of black blood. He sneered. Do you want to make it clearer? Why sure? Or why don't you ask AI Ching? AI Ching didn't say anything. She lowered her eyes. Do you see? Old Xiao sneered. You're the only one who is kept in the dark. No, there's one more. He stared maliciously at the pale girl behind Huai Shi. Give up, Huai Shi. Old Xiao shook his head and said mockingly, no matter how hard you struggle, you can't change the final result. Is it because my question is not simple enough, or you don't want to get the result from thinking? It was destined from the beginning, he laughed out loud. On this ship, there can only be one person who can reach the new world. This was the truth behind AI Ching's silence. The gods finally made a contract in the struggle and made a compromise after all kinds of intense or secret probing. The gods could cruelly punish these traitors, and the White Crown King was not generous. He didn't want homeless dogs and frustrated losers who only knew how to tuck their tails between their legs. The obstacles and curses of the gods were exactly what he wanted. Only in such a cruel and cold way could the fugitives completely extinguish their unrealistic delusions and face the cold reality and the tragic battle. From the beginning, this ship was not the ideal home of the fugitives. It was a big cauldron that smelted the miraculous gold from the dregs and waste. He would choose one winner from 100 losers. He would choose a true powerhouse from the countless abandoned dust. He would choose someone who could truly help him accomplish his great cause. This was the curse and blessing of the White Crown King. Among all the sinners on this ship, only one person would be pardoned by the White Crown King. Only one. When the Mayflower set sail, the final result was already destined. Nothing could be avoided. Everything that happened later was just a step toward the predetermined ending. It was just to welcome the final winner. At the moment of realization, Huai Shi felt a sharp pain in his skull, like erupting lava. He almost couldn't stand still. Violent waves reverberated in his source substance. It was as if an iron pen fell, engraving an order that couldn't be disobeyed in his soul stroke by stroke. It made him tremble and roar tragically. Do you finally understand? Why sure. Then, finally, let's guess. He laughed strangely and whispered softly. Whose philosopher's stone recorded this part of history? At that moment, Huai Shi roared and slashed down with his axe. It completely chopped off his dog's head. The broken head rolled on the ground, and the last mocking smile still remained. Everything of Paracelsus will be buried here. The broken head raised its eyes from the blood, and its lips opened and closed silently. It stared pitifully at Huai Shi and Lily in front of it. She died in your hands. Abraham Van Helsing, don't forget, this is your mission. He closed his eyes. Under the blade of Huai Shi's axe, it fell apart. In the gradually cold hand of the corpse, the 5 fingers slowly spread out, revealing the scratched wanderer coin. On the coin, the holy statue of the archangel stared indifferently at Huai Shi's face with a mocking smile. Huai Shi fell to the ground powerlessly, no longer able to hold the axe. Countless voices echoed in his ears, like thunder or soft whispers. The voices of thousands of people overlapped in his consciousness, giving him a mission that couldn't be disobeyed. Kill Paracelsus. Kill Lily. This was the mission that Van Helsing had to complete. This was the ending left in the Philosopher's Stone. This was everything that you had done with your own hands. At that moment, Huai Shi came to a realization from the pain of his soul being torn apart. He couldn't help but laugh. He laughed at himself. When he tried his best to pick up the gun on the ground and slowly got up from the ground, his eyes became unfamiliar. It was as if he had woken up from a long dream. Lily stared at him blankly for a long, long time. She seemed to finally understand something, but her pale face still had a sad confusion. So, you came to kill me, Huai Shi? Yes. Huai Shi nodded, enduring the pain in his skull, and his face gradually became ferocious. He slowly raised the pistol. He aimed at the girl's face. It shattered her last hope, and she couldn't hold back her tears. Why on earth? She choked and shouted. I just want to live. Huai Shi didn't answer. He just stared silently at her crying face. After a long time, he sighed softly. Yes, why is it so difficult to just want a happy life? He said, "Probably this world is like this." From the beginning, it was shrouded in the shadow of hell. Freedom was just a fleeting illusion, and the humble life was the currency at the fingertips of the gods. In such a world, how could there be any happiness to pursue? Huaishi's eyes drooped as she felt something within her body crumbling apart. "Sorry, I lied to you," he murmured softly. This was his final farewell and apology. Since this game was destined to end from the very beginning, it was time for it to end. Thus, the warmth of the past was no longer there. Huaishi pulled the trigger. Chapter 157. At that moment, everything was silent. Then, a violent roar engulfed everything. When the roar dissipated, Huaishi lowered his eyes and saw the blood on the ground, the dagger in his chest, and the crying Lily. "Oh, I missed. What a pity." Staring at the stunned face, Huaishi raised her eyebrows in delight. She chuckled softly, as if regretfully, and lowered her eyes. He knelt on the ground powerlessly. Lily looked at him blankly, as if she wanted to say something. Blood fell on her face. Her lips opened, but she couldn't speak. "I'm sorry. I can't accompany you on your trip." Huaishi leaned on her shoulder, panted, and whispered softly. Lily looked at him blankly and couldn't help but wail. She reached out, wanting to save him, but Huaishi held her hand tightly. It was deadly. Huaishi raised his head, looked at her face, and forced her to look into his eyes. "Listen to me, Lily. From today onwards, you have to learn to be alone." He tried his best to breathe and told her, "When you arrive in a new world, you have to start living alone, working alone, and traveling alone. You will embrace your own fate and future, face the storms of the future alone, and in the end, you may die quietly alone. But you can't be afraid, and you can't run away." Huaishi stroked the girl's cheek, stared at her crying eyes, and whispered, "Because you are not alone, so you have to have courage." He slowly raised his hand and gently hugged Lily's shoulder, using all his strength. "Goodbye, Lily." He said goodbye. "Goodbye, my friend. Thank you for your company. Thank you for everything you did for me. Thank you for the hug." When he raised his eyes, he saw the broken dark clouds in the sky, as well as the twinkling stars under the bright moon. The blood color of the quiet sea dissipated, and a gentle and warm, fresh wind came out. At the end of the sea, the outline of the continent and the mountains faintly appeared. Their trip had arrived at the main point. The short journey was about to come to an end. He smiled, closed his eyes, and exhaled his last breath. "I wish you a safe journey." "Why didn't you stop him?" KP looked down at the final scene and sighed softly. "I thought you would at least let him kill the girl. After all, this is just a game." "Yes, this is just a game." AI Ching calmly lit the cigarette in the corner of her mouth. "Unfortunately, I prefer this ending." As she spoke, she replaced Huaishi and raised her middle finger at KP, telling him one word at a time, "You're the one who's going to die." F*CK your game. KP calmly accepted the anger and contempt from AI Ching and Huaishi. He calmly closed the rule book in his hand, took off the glasses on his face, and shook his head slightly. "Should I say that it's inconceivable or natural? You actually made the same choice as in the previous round. If the first time was a coincidence, then the second time can't be described as a coincidence." He paused for a moment and nodded solemnly to AI Ching. "Your determination and will are admirable, Ms. AI. Your respect for the story also surprised me. I have to admit that I underestimated you. Can such beautiful words change the ending?" AI Ching stubbed out the cigarette and looked up at him. "If you want to do something, do it quickly. Don't think about listening to me beg for mercy." "No, I think you misunderstood something." KP stared at the screen in the game and smiled. "The game is not over yet. After all, everything that has happened now is not allowed by someone." At his fingertips, a chess piece overflowing with deep blood color appeared and was slowly placed on the table. At that moment, in the darkness, a cold eye opened. Ending error, fallacy in the third branch, deviation in the logical direction, begin correction. Correction failed. Problem report uploaded. Central core analysis begins. analysis complete, beginning correction, thus time stopped abruptly in an instant. In the darkness of death, Huaishur opened her eyes and heard countless roars and shouts. In the end, they turned into a thunderous roar that exploded in her soul. Rebellion, rebellion, rebellion. As if there was a substantial thunder falling from the sky, it penetrated his soul. Some kind of rigid and resolute power operated in his consciousness and began to search for the seeds of rebellion and correct the wrong thoughts. Everything that had happened now was reversed and together with time. At that moment, Huaishur opened his eyes in severe pain and peeked into the depths of the layers of darkness. There was a thin figure standing in the darkness with a pair of blood-red eyes. It was so familiar. It was the Philosopher's Stone that recorded all of this. The memories left by the former Van Helsing. In the original history, Van Helsing chose to kill the woman who trusted him and successfully passed the test to reach the New World. In the end, he joined the American genealogy and became a shameful traitor. In the silence, KP slowly said, after 270 years, he almost exiled himself and devoted himself to the cause of opening up hell. Even when he advanced to the Fifth Order Blue Crown Dragon, he never returned to the present realm, as if he was escaping something. Until he died of old age in the 21st level of hell, there was not a day when he did not regret the choice he made that day. There was not a day when he did not repent for that pure and sad soul. This is the original sin he committed in order to be reborn, an unchangeable fact. He lowered his eyes in pity and sighed softly. Just like that, with deep regret, he died, leaving this record in the Philosopher's Stone. So, I'm sorry, Ms. AI. He slowly shook his head. This is the established history, the destined fate of him and her, the determined ending of this story. The remorse and sorrow of countless times in the past was now only a remnant of a huge obsession. It forgot why it existed and what had happened in the past. It was just like a machine, repeating everything in the past over and over again, witnessing this eternal, original sin. It was because of this that no change was allowed, and all the endings could not be forgiven for being destroyed. Kill Paracelsus. The vampire stared at Huaishur's eyes, and a violent power poured into his soul. The huge will shook in the void and burst out with blazing electric light, changing Huaishur's will inch by inch. Complete your mission. A thunderous roar of rage reverberated in his soul. Kill her and obtain your redemption. F*CK, your redemption. At that moment, Huaishur raised his eyes from the turmoil of his soul, even though his eyes had been scorched by the crazy electric light and were spewing out flames. The modification of the will came to an abrupt end. In front of the thick book, countless huge wills collapsed like waves crashing on a reef. Huaishur roared angrily. She went against the imposing gaze coming from the darkness and moved forward. He stretched out his hand and suddenly stuck it in the darkness. It was as if he was pulling back time, causing the reverse time to stagnate. The record shook, but then it came to an abrupt end. It was forced into a stagnation under his will. Huaishur reached out and pulled up the vampire's collar. His charred eyes stared at the vampire's empty face and told him word by word, "I don't want this kind of redemption." The vampire's illusion shattered with a loud bang. "You're going to lose, KP." At that moment, at the front of the audience, Crow calmly made the final judgment. KP looked up in astonishment and saw the cracks on the chess piece. This was a contradiction from the inside out, and it was also an incredible discovery. Van Helsing's record was defying his Philosopher's Stone. His history was defying his will. This story abandoned its original master. Then, it chose a new protagonist and stood beside Huaishur. Then, the earth shook, the world roared, and everything that had stagnated began to move in a new direction, toward a new ending. Resisting the will that was constantly exerting heavy pressure, resisting the power of the Philosopher's Stone. Boom! Huaishur's soul shook violently, and cracks appeared. He stretched out his hand and suddenly pierced into the void. He found the original ending from the countless broken records and suddenly clenched it, as if he was holding a piece of red-hot iron. He didn't care that his soul was collapsing. Then he saw the girl who had fallen in a pool of blood due to her destined fate, and her eyes that slowly closed in sorrow. She was dead. Such an ending, Huaishur announced hoarsely. I won't allow it, even if this was real history. Even if all of this could no longer be changed, even if it was a dream, in all of this fiction, there should be a place for her in this world. Then, under KP's stunned expression, he roared and completely tore the original ending to shreds, together with layers of darkness. He pulled open a crack in the countless records and glimpsed the enormous will that operated behind them. It shook angrily and set off a howling counterattack. And Huaishur, in a daze, stretched out his hand and tightly grasped the void in front of him. Then, a metallic light burst forth from his fingertips. The light, as sharp as the stars, gathered in his hand and multiplied inch by inch. In an instant, it formed a slender and ferocious cross-shaped spear. Surging origin substance flowed on its blade, interweaving into a gorgeous and complicated pattern. With his command, it burst forth with the brilliance of the scorching sun. From the darkness, Huaishur stepped forward, raised his arm, and stabbed out with a soundless roar. With this attack, the final ending was decided. Let the dust settle. Bang! A dream, an illusion, a bubble. Everything dissipated. In a daze, Huaishur heard the sound of something shattering. When countless lights and shadows flitted past in front of him, he had already returned to the cabin that seemed familiar to him. His hand held the slender iron, still maintaining the posture of a lunge. In front of him, in the open safe, the philosopher's stone that was as resplendent as a dream had already been pierced through by the spear's blade. Light green blood flowed out from the enormous crystal-like pupil. The crack spread. The philosopher's stone silently shattered. In the deathly stillness, Huaishur forced a smile and fell to the ground. He was unconscious. In a daze, he seemed to have heard the sound of something shattering. In the deep night, the swaying lifeboat drifted between the waves. Lily turned her head in astonishment, searching for the source of the sound. There, the sailboat that was riddled with holes was swallowed up by the flames, gradually sinking into the turbulent waves. But at a certain moment, she seemed to see the shadow of a youth at the bow of the boat. He happily waved goodbye to her, turned around, and walked into the rising flames. He disappeared. Only the faint sound of a cello could be heard from the flames. It was gentle and low, dancing under the waves and starlight. It was as beautiful as the creation of a soul. Huaishur, the girl stared blankly at the gradually extinguishing flames. After a long, long time, she weakly curled up on the boat and cried, just like a newborn baby. In the distance, the faint light of dawn shone, illuminating the land of the new continent. Her life had officially begun. Chapter 158. In KP's silence, the game came to an end. A thick book jumped out from the light and opened in front of him in Crow. Countless pages flipped and finally stopped at the blank space at the end of the scroll. A silver feather pen jumped on the page, ignoring KP's astonishment, and left a line of dark words announcing the end. False end. Empty ending. No person survived. KP looked down at the line of words and was stunned. Oh, really? Isn't that too rude? Crow laughed happily. Not long ago, I felt that this child had the potential to become a villain. I didn't expect him to improve so quickly. As she spoke, she raised her eyes and stared at her former colleagues in front of her. So, how do you feel, hosts? She asked softly. Is my clerk still worthy of your attention? Is he the kind of recorder you are looking for? Is he someone who can treat the past and the future equally, adjudicate record and reality, and balance fiction and truth? Wonderful, KP whispered softly. Wonderful. He finally raised his eyes, but there was no annoyance or unhappiness in them. Instead, they were full of surprise and excitement, sparkling, wonderful. This is a legendary performance. Legendary. Behind him, a woman in a black robe appeared. She nodded slightly, but did not hide her admiration, a hero destined by the heavens. On the other empty chair beside the table, an old man with a solemn face raised his deep eyes and said in a low voice, "What an admirable feat thus!" Crone nodded in satisfaction and rubbed her little wings. "Then, let's discuss the next thing. For example, compensation." When Huaisher opened his eyes from his drowsiness, he felt as if he was going to die from exhaustion. It was as uncomfortable as being beaten up by 100,000 people after running 100,000 marathons with a hangover. "Who am I? Where am I? What happened?" Then he saw old Shaw grinning in front of him. "Not bad, kid." The rough man patted him on the shoulder. "Not bad." Huaisher jumped out of bed in fright and almost knocked over the forge rip hanging on his body. He almost lost control and chopped down with his axe. Wake up, wake up. It's all over." Old Shao coughed awkwardly and turned to look at his supervisor, the smiling old man. "What are you waiting for? Come and explain yourself. Look at what you've done in my face. If I had known, I wouldn't have come." "What happened?" Huaisher was dumbfounded. He saw AI Ching sitting at the table with a gloomy face and KP, who was smiling and playing dice across the table. Cough, cough. To put it simply, this is an impromptu inspection. The old inspector coughed twice and said, "Under Mr. KP's suggestion, we will use the recovery of the Philosopher's Stone as a test." "What?" Huaisher was dumbfounded. "This was all arranged by you?" "Although there were some unpleasant accidents, some of them." Yes." The old inspector, who played the role of Old Shao in the module, smiled awkwardly and reached out his hand. "Please forgive us for offending you." Huaisher was dumbfounded. He looked at AI Ching, trying to figure out what was going on. AI Ching's expression was still ugly. To put it simply, the operation was a test from the beginning. Both of us were played in circles. Heh, even the examiner himself almost failed. "Don't say that, Miss AI. Although there were many accidents, this is still an inspection for you and Mr. Y." The old inspector coughed awkwardly and looked away. "What accident?" "It's a long story." The old inspector pondered for a moment and sighed helplessly. In fact, at the beginning, there was no module or game. According to the original plan, everyone raided the smuggler's cargo ship. Wushuang had a great time, but no one expected that when they were about to successfully recover the Philosopher's Stone fragment, a traitor would suddenly stab them in the back. Lei Feizhou, under the instructions of his inspector, they were prepared to steal the Philosopher's Stone fragment and run away, hiding at the border to dispose of the stolen goods. In the beginning, the stab went very smoothly until they tried to stab Huaisher in the back. Things went wrong. According to the inspector's description, Huaisher, who understood the situation, displayed a terrifying reaction speed. Relying on his killing skills, he fought guerrilla warfare on the ship, displaying a terrifying combat strength beyond imagination. In a short 15 minutes, Lei Feizhou and the 4 ascendant companions he had contacted were all dealt with as easily as chopping vegetables. In the end, Lei Feizhou was driven to desperation and directly activated the Philosopher's Stone fragment, triggering a large-scale corrosion phenomenon, leading to unknown consequences. Helpless, KP could only use some method to forcibly erase this incident and start over. This was the first cycle. However, the Philosopher's Stone fragment had already completely corroded the surroundings, turning the ship and the surrounding area into an ever-expanding hell. The difficulty of recovery soared to a terrifying level, and the second cycle of recovery failed. The Astronomy Association had no choice but to agree with KP's suggestion, covering the area with the dark net border, forcibly modularizing everything, and then started the third cycle. The scheming and fighting of this story could easily fill up 200,000 words in the Book of Destiny. Huaisher felt extremely regretful after hearing it. Why was it omitted? However, he still felt that there was something wrong. When he subconsciously looked at KP only smiled mysteriously and didn't say anything. Instead, KP secretly winked at him when no one was paying attention. After explaining to Huaisher, the old inspector said seriously, "Madam AI, during the inspection, you have shown the qualities of an inspector. You have a keen sense of thinking and smell, as well as the deep trust between you and your colleagues, as well as the calmness and decisiveness in the face of adversity. The Central Administration praised your performance and approved your promotion application, and once again invited you to join the Central Decision-Making Conference. I already said, I refuse. AI Ching indifferently interrupted him. Cut the crap. I hope we'll meet again at the internal meeting. Okay, I hope you'll be merciful at that time. The old inspector smiled helplessly and looked at Huaisher seriously. As for you, Mr. Huai, you've successfully completed the mission I expected to be impossible. Moreover, you have the integrity and outstanding skills that are rarely seen in this era. Although your thinking is a bit simple and you have a tendency to be overly violent, this can't hide your outstanding talent. The Astronomy Association is proud to have an operation member like you. This is your official certificate. We will complete the registration later. If you have time in the next few months, you can come to Jinling to register. Pfft. In the corner, Yin Yin snorted in disdain. When he noticed Huaisher's gaze, he unhappily retracted his gaze. He continued to shrink. Mr. Yin has been temporarily disqualified as an inspector because of his behavior of endangering colleagues during the operation. Your inquiry will be held in Jinling later. Please pay attention to the notice. The old inspector shook his head in pity. After filling out the form in his hand, he handed Huaisher a new certificate. Then, my mission is complete. He put away the things in his hands with a smile and bid farewell to the others. Soon, only he and AI Ching were left in the room. I was completely fooled. AI Ching sighed unwillingly. She tapped on the armrest with a gloomy expression and closed her eyes. In the silence, Huaisher awkwardly coughed twice. AI Ching, yeah? AI Ching looked up at him. She was still angry. Thank you. Although I don't know what you encountered, I really have to thank you. Huaisher solemnly nodded and thanked her. Isn't it the job of an inspector to leave the operation to the subordinates and bear the consequences yourself? AI Ching looked at him and looked away with disinterest. I'm going out to get some fresh air. You have a good rest. A boat will pick us up later. Okay. Before leaving, AI Ching's wheelchair paused for a moment. She was silent for a long time before she sighed helplessly. She turned around and said, You did a good job. Yeah? Without explaining anything, AI Ching pushed the door open and left them alone in the room. In the silence, Huaisher turned around and saw KP, who had reappeared behind the table. You're leaving already? KP raised his eyebrows, shook his head, and sighed. What a straightforward girl. It must be hard to have such a boss. Actually, it's okay. Huaisher scratched his head and looked at him awkwardly. After a long time, he couldn't help but ask, was it really just a test? It was a part of it. At least that's what they thought. KP shrugged. Don't worry. They just hitch a ride. I kept the key parts a secret for you. Thank you. Huaisher nodded and looked at the small box on the table in front of him. The transparent box contained a broken crystal ball. It was exquisitely carved like an eye. That was the fragment of the Philosopher's Stone. Unfortunately, more than half of the miracles in it had been lost. It was no longer useful. Don't worry about it. Anyway, it was mostly consumed to maintain that module. Compared to what we gained, what we lost is not worth mentioning. KP comforted him understandingly. Then he raised his eyebrows and clapped his hands happily. Then, as good friends of the investigator, we will enter the stage of the day after tomorrow in the stage of growth. Although you didn't successfully clear the module, you completed an unexpected ending. As a master of this game, I must give you a reward. There's a reward? Huaisher was stunned. Of course, KP said matter-of-factly. The original reward for clearing the module was this character card. As long as you have enough source substance, you could transform into Van Helsing's character again for a short time. But to be honest, I feel that this meager reward can't recognize everything you've done. As he spoke, he tore Van Helsing's character card into pieces without any hesitation. What the hell? Wait a minute. Huaisher was dumbfounded. He originally wanted to say that it didn't matter and that he didn't mind if KP quickly gave it to him. But he didn't expect KP to act so quickly. That was a border relic that, as long as there was enough source substance, would allow a person to instantly transform into a peak stage 3 ascendant. And it was only one step away from becoming an angel of authority. In other words, as long as Huaishur had enough, he could transform into a holy light fighter at any time. How could he tear it apart just like that? Anyway, let's put this matter aside for now. Let's roll the screen reward first. KP took out a thick rulebook and explained the meaning to Huaishur. It seemed that in this game, as long as a player completed a module, his character would be able to grow and obtain a skill reward. But according to KP, this reward could actually be placed directly on him, a free skill upgrade. Huaishur's eyes lit up with excitement. Following KP's guidance, he began to roll the die for judgment. Soon, his face became incomparably dark, and he was lost in the blue sky of Africa, dumbfounded. Bluff, persuasion, and stealth. These were skills that had been successful in the module, but one by one they had failed to grow. After rolling around, only the most basic listen and detect were upgraded. Soon, as the die rolled, Huaishur only felt his eyes light up, and the world seemed to instantly become much clearer. Countless tiny traces that he had overlooked were vivid in front of his eyes, and his ears could even hear the rustling of the clothes of those people outside the cabin, as well as the low echoes of the surging waves like a symphony. His perception, which had been raised to the limit by the ghost, actually increased by a large margin. Just this alone was a pleasant surprise. But then, when he rolled the die for the last time, a large amount of knowledge unexpectedly emerged in his mind about the properties of various metals, the methods to process them, and the details to pay attention to in each process. Originally, he had only memorized the information and knowledge from so many books, but at this moment, he had unexpectedly mastered it through a comprehensive study. And the various details and key points mentioned by Crow when he was teaching were also vivid in his mind. Alchemy's growth test passed. In an instant, he had gone through a long period of repeatedly memorizing, unceasingly and futilely trying and experimenting to slowly master the stage, and he had officially become a beginner. When he raised his palm and focused his mind, he glimpsed countless fine metal fragments floating in the air above his palm. The pure white alchemy fire rose up, the temperature flexibly changing, quickly melting, refining, purifying, extracting, and even synthesizing them, until finally, it turned into a surging silver-white liquid. A small miracle had happened. Silver blood potion. Although the potion's effect was slightly weak, Huaishur had already skipped the long period of apprenticeship in one fell swoop, only relying on his hands to complete the results that were previously unreachable. Just when he was pleasantly surprised, he heard KP excitedly snap his fingers in contemplation. It was like a flash of inspiration. "I got it." KP happily raised his eyes. "This is the most suitable reward for you." Just when Huaishur raised his head in amazement, he saw KP stretch out his hand towards him from afar, as if he had grabbed something and pulled it back. Huaishur's brain suddenly buzzed, as if something had been pulled out from his soul by KP. When he raised his eyes to look, he found that KP had a gorgeous cross-shaped spear in his hand. The silver-white spear blade was engraved with layers of complicated emblems, exquisite and solemn, as if it had gathered all the light in the world. The Spear of Compassion. KP lowered his head and stared at the inscriptions on the spear, nodding in admiration. Good name. As he said that, he reached out and picked up the fragment of the Philosopher's Stone on the table, the repenting eye that once belonged to the Fifth Order Sublimator, Blue-Crowned Dragon Van Helsing. The crystal eye in his hand turned into a stream of light, adhering to the spear blade. It illuminated KP's smile. "Let's use this to commemorate your dragon-slaying feat." At that moment, the light dissipated from the spear blade, and on the silver-white blade, there was an additional trace of blood that had yet to dry. The seemingly endless blood of the azure-crowned dragon slowly dripped from the tip of the spear and landed on the ground. The ground silently decayed, and soon after, pure white irises bloomed from the decaying ground. It emitted a refreshing fragrance. Defeating evil, subverting fate, and saving the princess trapped in the endless cycle of death. Your actions are the embodiment of glory. KP smiled, looking at the magnificent spear. From 1620 to now, such a long time has been pierced through by this spear. This is the proof of an immortal legend. As he said that, he turned the spear around, elegantly and solemnly holding it in front of Huaishur. Huaishur slowly reached out and held the handle of the spear. With a thought, the gorgeous cross-shaped spear shrunk inch by inch, turning into an ancient book in his hand. When he lowered his head to look at it, he saw the ancient title on the cover that had weathered the passage of time. 400 years of shock, he was stunned. KP, with the last glimmer of hope, he stared at the man in front of him. Is Lily really still alive? Who knows? KP smiled mysteriously. The life and death of a human is like morning dew and bubbles, and the life and death of an android is even more illusory. Moreover, isn't she a person who won't appear in the world? An illusory life, an ethereal death, it is difficult to define. But is that real, or is reality and illusion really that important? KP said calmly, I believe that no matter what it is, you will treat it equally, always the same, and that is enough. I'm sincerely grateful for your tolerance and generosity. As he said that, he took a step back and took off his hat and coat from the shelf next to him. Then, Mr. Huaishur, allow me to say goodbye here. KP bowed solemnly. I sincerely hope that one day, you and Miss Lily can meet again in this dreamlike world. He paused for a moment and smiled meaningfully. Until then, please wait and hope. In the silence, KP turned and left. The door closed. Huaishur looked at the ancient book in his hand in a daze. Is this the end of the story? Maybe. Chapter 159. 400 years ago, in a new world, under the gloomy sky, a dim light shone through the gaps between the clouds, illuminating the gray waves in front of the reef. Countless sharp reefs protruded from the shore into the sky in a disorderly manner. They were as sharp as blades, cutting the waves that surged up again and again. Broken rails and charred sails floated up from the broken waves. Countless pieces of debris washed up to the shore, half buried in the sand. More were taken away by the waves again. They disappeared into the deep sea. In the silence, there was a thin figure standing quietly on the shore, like a stone statue, waiting silently. It was difficult to see his face because his face was too handsome and the light of the world could not illuminate it. He did not know how to look at the robe on his body because the robe was too solemn and his eyes could not bear it. The only thing generously revealed between the sea and the sky was the cold and solemn white crown on his head. It was like the truth, like a miracle, like everything inconceivable. It existed here, and it was real. Then everything was like a dream, and it was difficult to show one's substance in front of it. One could only admit one's insignificance and humility. In this seemingly eternal wait, the lonely king of the white crown stood silently on the edge of the sea, quietly staring into the distance, watching countless ships sailing in the stormy waves, countless people chanting their names, countless people shouting in despair or piously praying. But he did not help them because of their piety, nor did he punish them because of their rebellion and arrogance. He just waited. Amidst the murky waves, a few broken sampans staggered forward and crawled pathetically to the shore. The victims soaked in the water were pale, holding the reef in front of them with difficulty, crawling on the sharp edge, letting their bodies be cut, gasping for breath. They looked sadly behind them. The huge fleet stopped on the surface of the sea. The raging fire burning vigorously, and tragic screams and wails could be heard. After a long, long time, they all sank to the point where they were only one step away from salvation. The old survivors lowered their heads, and tears flowed down their faces behind mottled white hair, but they did not dare to look. Instead, they lowered their heads and knelt in the turbid waves, kowtowing piously, crawling forward inch by inch at the feet of the supreme existence. Please have mercy, the supreme king of the white crown. The tearful guide raised his head and prayed for the god's mercy. So, the king of the white crown looked down, but there was no fluctuation in his calm eyes. Peter of the Campbell clan, Simon of the Russell clan, Garcia of the Jackson clan, Haywood of the Cape clan. At this point, he pointed out the names of those who had bowed their heads one by one. The Supreme Existence then softly asked, "Why have you come? To have an audience and pay tribute?" The old man kowtowed again, and his tears fell into the gravel, dissolving silently. We want to offer you everything we have. Great Supreme King, we came with our entire clan and gave everything, but now, other than the traitor Helsing clan, who has become the god's lackey, our 16 vampire clans, hundreds of elites, and thousands of clansmen, the wealth and family property that we have accumulated for thousands of years, everything has been buried in this cold storm under the god's wrath, he said. Now, other than the lives of the 14 of us, we have nothing to offer you. In the silence, the King of the White Crown listened indifferently, but he did not speak. Only the old men trembled and knelt on the ground, kowtowing and begging humbly, until he spoke, "Then offer sacrifice." The guide was stunned, and then, as if he had been granted amnesty, he turned around and waved behind him. Then, someone went forward on his knees, holding a small swaddling cloth, and placed the sleeping baby at the feet of the king of pure white. In his deep sleep, the small baby sucked his fingers sweetly, as if he was immersed in a beautiful dream. The old men raised their heads expectantly, looking up at the King of the White Crown's face, ignoring the cold majesty that stung their eyes, and tears of blood slowly flowed down. After a long time, the King of the White Crown nodded slightly, yes. Then, the old men laughed, as if they had been released, and respectfully kowtowed before the Supreme King, praising his kindness and grace. The guide at the front took out a sharp knife from his arms, raised it devoutly, and pierced it into his own chest. Blood flowed out. He closed his eyes in satisfaction, handed the handle of the knife to the person behind him, and then silently turned into ashes. Then the second old man came forward, knelt, offered his blood, and disappeared in the wind. One after another. In the end, the old woman pierced the blood-soaked knife into her heart, but the merciless death did not come. She was stunned for a moment, and then stabbed again in fear, but her life continued. "Don't be afraid. I have accepted your sacrifice," the King of the White Crown calmly instructed. "One day, I will collect it from you, but not now," he said. "You have a more important mission. You have to continue to exist. It is my honor. Please give me your enlightenment." In such a gift and generosity, the old woman shed tears of gratitude, kowtowed devoutly, and waited for the king's edict. "Take this child to the east," the King of the White Crown said. The White Crown King said, "Go to the place where the golden bull stands. That is the promised land that I gave you. You have to raise him, tell him the sacrifice and piety you have offered today, and also tell him that the old blood has flowed out today, but new blood will multiply endlessly because in the future, the blood of the whole world will come here. You have lost your people, but new people will be born. The wealth you have lost today, you will gain 10,000 times or more in the future." The King of the White Crown declared, "This is my agreement with you. Go and engrave it on the stone foundation of the golden bull. As long as the golden bull exists, your prosperity will be indestructible." So, in the midst of the devout praise, the old woman picked up the baby, kowtowed, and walked towards the east. She disappeared into the wilderness. Everything returned to silence. But the long wait continued on. Countless people came, countless people kowtowed, and countless people left with redemption. From beginning to end, the King of the White Crown calmly witnessed everything. Until a long time later, in the fog on the distant sea, a small lifeboat drifted over, carrying the girl who should not have existed. On that illusory face, the King of the White Crown's eyes seemed to look up, and then he understood. "A new branch of the matter?" He commented indifferently. "You have created a fantasy that should never have appeared, and deliberately created a future that should not have existed. Whose arrangement is this?" Behind him, 3 figures appeared. An old man, a woman in black, and a middle-aged man with glasses, who should not have existed here, bowed with their hands on their chests, and paid their respects to the king of the White Crown. The king of the White Crown glanced at them indifferently, and his tone became mocking. DM, what could be gained from endless risks and staking everything on a single bet? Utopia? The old man's face was calm, and his eyes were lowered. St. Can the eternal darkness and the undercurrent struggle lead to a bright future in scheming? The woman in the black robe did not speak, and her smile did not change. KP, what are you pursuing? Knowledge beyond human knowledge? Wisdom beyond human wisdom? The king of the White Crown easily saw through the nature of the newcomers, and his arrogance was not concealed. Knowledge beyond human knowledge is no inspiration to humans, and wisdom beyond human wisdom is useless to humans. When courage is exhausted, there is nothing at the end of fear. What you seek is an illusion, and what you get is only nothingness. The so-called kingdom of heaven is such a meaningless place. But this is our mission, isn't it? The newcomer spoke, and the three voices overlapped. The end of the eternal search must have meaning. The king of the White Crown raised his eyebrows, and after a long time, he indifferently retracted his gaze. Then, what have the guests from the other timeline brought me? A possibility, the DM said, a possibility of saving. What are we taking away? St. said, a hope to avoid repeating the same mistakes. After a short moment of silence, the king of the White Crown nodded. A fair trade. He reached out his hand. Thus, the three opened their palms, and the three broken pages overlapped, turning into an ancient scroll, and fell into the hands of the White Crown King. From the silent surging of the waves, the majestic figure dissipated into the void. No, it should be said that they were sent out of their own domain by the White Crown King. There was also the lifeboat that was slowly approaching the shore. On the boat, the girl who was soaked in the waves woke up from her drowsiness, opened her sleepy eyes, and stared at this strange world. It was cold and dark, cruel as if there was no warmth. She's cold, St. said with pity. He took off a pitch-black robe from his body and gently wrapped it around the girl's shoulders. Yes, thirsty and hungry. The DM sighed and lit a bonfire. The soup on the fire boiled, and the fish was already crispy. And lonely and painful. KP waved his hand, and the dark clouds dispersed. The turbid waves were clear, and the bright sun shone between the sea and the sky. Clusters of green plants and flowers grew out of the sharp crevices, and the world was beautiful. The girl looked at them blankly and shrank back in fear, holding the broken axe blade in her arms. Who are you? The people who came to greet you. St. stared at her gently. Like you, guests who don't belong here. The DM nodded. Like you, they belong to the fantasy that doesn't exist in reality. KP shrugged. They're essentially the same, phantoms that don't live in the world. The spirits that only existed in records and rumors said so, staring at the girl in front of them, their eyes warm and gentle. But you're different from us. Yes, not bound by the mission, with freedom and a future with possibilities. St. reached out and gently pulled her up, leading her to the bonfire to feel the warmth. You are here for me? Lily couldn't believe it. To be exact, I took credit for accurately intercepting your records and creating the path to this fictitious branch, KP said proudly. Noticing the fierce glances of his two companions, he suddenly smiled awkwardly. Well, there were some accidents in the middle, but in short, the result is perfect. Yes, perfect. In the end, he shut up in embarrassment. St. said, I brought you the frankincense. She opened her 5 fingers, revealing the pure white and crystal clear cream, carrying a pure prayer. I brought gold, the DM said. Since he took out a box from his arms, in the open box, the gorgeous metal shone like the brilliance of the philosopher's stone, showing the inextinguishable faith. Cough, cough, powder. KP took out a string of amber in a hurry. The amber reflected the light of the fire, like a mind that bloomed after being tempered. Here, he gave her a prayer that brought miracles, so that she could return to reality from nothingness. Then, he gave her an inextinguishable faith, so that she would not be lost in the countless complicated things. Finally, he gave her a firm mind, so that she could walk to the end of this dreamlike mortal world. So, illusion and reality were reversed here, and the boundary between fantasy and reality was overturned. With a record of nothingness, an unknown branch and hypothesis was derived from the history of 400 years ago. The past gradually changed in many legends and anecdotes, forming a completely different story. A story that was passed down 400 years later. In a trance, the girl seemed to understand something and looked at them in a daze. "Am I fictitious?" she asked softly. "Fake. You will exist." The sage who came in the opposite direction said, "The child who denied the miracle and the saintess who denied the abyss, the soul that originated from nothingness, the pure person. Gila, your existence is the proof of this miracle." They stared at the girl and brought a new fate. In the distant future, there will be another story about hell and heaven to be told again. And you will become a human, become a legend, a spirit of things. Become the creator, and far surpass us. Go and witness all of this. They said, from this moment onwards, this was the beginning of this story in the distant past. The beginning. Chapter 160. Name: Why Sure. Age: 17. Occupation: coward. No, it just slipped out of my mouth. Why Sure coughed twice. Occupation is student, also the secretary of the Astronomy Society, an Exion High, and an action member. I say, can we turn off the light? Under the glaring light, he tried his best to raise his hands that were handcuffed to the table. He wanted to block his eyes, but he was still a little short. The length was not enough. No. The interrogator on the other side of the table slammed the teacup on the table and asked coldly, "Tell me, where were you at 7:30 last night? Who were you with, and what were you planning to do?" Weisher pursed his lips. "Garden restaurant, with your daughter. We were going to have dinner." Bang! Division Chief Fu slammed his hand on the table and widened his eyes. "You still dare to King say that? Is it because I can't hold the gun anymore, or have you lost your mind? I've told you time and time again, and you still dare to seduce my daughter." Cough, cough. Weisher covered his mouth and coughed a few times. He explained with a straight face, "It's like this. This is a philosophical question. Humans are all born and raised by their parents, right? As long as it's a human, then it must be someone's son or daughter, right? In other words, as long as I go out for dinner, then I will definitely have dinner with someone's son or daughter, but this person's father just happens to be you. Look at this. Isn't this a coincidence?" FNMDP. Division Chief Fu glared at him hatefully. He gritted his teeth so hard that they were about to shatter. "Look at what you've done. It's one thing to break the law. Our father-daughter relationship has just improved a little, and now it's King happening again. You can't blame me for forgetting to go to the school's anniversary celebration, right? You don't want to see your wife, right?" Weisher sighed. "What a coincidence. Your wife also thinks the same." Against the light, Weisher studied Elder Fu's gloomy face. He shook his head and sighed. "Then both of you stood her up. What a sin. What does that have to do with you eating with her?" Weisher rolled his eyes. He really couldn't stand him. "Please, she's not young anymore. She's eating with her friends, not going to a hotel. Why do you care?" Bang! "You still want to have King go to a hotel?" Just as he finished speaking, a black shadow pounced on him and pulled him up from the chair. His face was ferocious. "I knew you were up to no good, you little bastard. For example, let me give you an example." Weisher was almost out of breath. "Let go of me. I'm calling for help. Save me. The Special Affairs Division is beating people up. Help." Director Fu, forget it. The people next to him were also stunned and quickly rushed forward. Some of them tried to break his hand, some tried to calm him down, and some tried to say something nice. After a long time, they finally managed to stuff Director Fu back into his chair. What a pity for all parents. Weisher sighed and shook his head helplessly. He flicked a piece of iron wire from between his fingers and twisted it a few times inside the handcuffs before unlocking them. After moving his wrists a little, he He straightened his collar and sat up straight. He said earnestly, "Hey, old Fu, you know my character. Who are you calling old Fu?" Director Fu's eyes widened. "Your character? Don't you know how despicable you are? That's F asterisk king enough." Huaishir was so angry that he wanted to flip the table. Then he said helplessly, "Forget it. Let's not talk about this anymore. I swear to God, I don't have any bad intentions toward your daughter." Huh? Old Fu's expression darkened. "You mean you're not interested in her now that you're noble?" Huaishir felt like he was going to explode. His head hurt. "Big brother, you're really my big brother. It's wrong to like her, and it's also wrong to not like her. What the F asterisk CK do you want?" Old Fu's face turned green. "If you take advantage of me again, I'll throw you out of here. Do you believe me?" Okay. Huaishir lowered his head helplessly and begged for mercy. "Fu, he is my good brother. Even if I die today, even if I jump down from this building, I won't think about dating her. What era are we in now? Please put away all your dirty thoughts. She's a good student, but you're not." Director Fu stared at the little bastard in front of him vigilantly. It was as if he was looking at a thief who sneaked into his backyard with a hoe when he wasn't at home. "Don't you know what kind of person Fu he is? Okay, you don't know her very well, but you should at least have some confidence in her. Okay?" Huaishir scratched his head and sighed. "To be honest, I'm not interested in your family's relationship, and I don't intend to interfere in her personal affairs. But at the very least, you have to understand that not everyone's head is filled with adolescent hormones and blindly fall in love. Not everyone needs their father to send a sniper to target their classmates with infrared cameras 24/7. Not everyone needs their mother to send a detective to investigate the background of every classmate. Besides, even if you do this, is it really useful? Can you change your mind?" Director Fu was speechless. After a long time, he sighed irritably. "She's in her rebellious phase. I have to say, if she's in her rebellious phase, you're really saving yourself a lot of trouble." Huaishir shook his head. He didn't want to argue with the biological father of his classmate about teaching his daughter anymore. He was thinking about getting the business done as soon as possible. But he suddenly forgot what the business was. "By the way, what am I doing here? How would I know?" Director Fu was furious. "Do you think the Special Affairs Division is your home? Do you have nothing better to do? I just came in and was handcuffed here without saying anything. I'm also very desperate." Huaishir suddenly became more and more angry. After thinking for a long time, he finally remembered and slapped his forehead. "All right, my border hunter license and excursion permit." Thus, old Fu's expression became very reluctant. 10 minutes later, the clerk handed a whole folder to Huaishir. "TSK." Director Fu sent him out and reminded him in the end, "Don't think that you can do whatever you want just because you have a license and permit. You have to abide by the law, understand? You're the one who took the lead in breaking the law. What right do you have to say that to me?" Huaishir carried his backpack and walked away. "I'm running away. I won't come again next time. Who could stand being locked up every time they came to this stupid place?" Not long after he left, he received a call from Fu Yi. The voice on the other end of the phone was quite noisy. He could hear people coming and going. "Are you free?" She vaguely heard the sound of typing on the keyboard. She said, "I'm in an internet cafe with Lu Rong and Liao Jun. Come on, I'll take you up." "Forget it. The last person who wanted to play with me has been dead for 400 years. Huaishir shook his head and thought for a while before explaining, "Don't worry, I'm fine. We're just sharing our experiences. It's just a meal. Do you think he'll send me to the border?" "Yes, we'll eat again next time." Fu Yi's tone seemed to be a little more relaxed. "What do you want to eat?" Liao Jun's voice sounded from the other end of the phone. "Bring me along. It's my treat. There's a barbecue place nearby. Go away. Go away. You've lost all your points. You only know how to eat. I'm stuck. Zoom in, zoom in. Rong Rong, let's go. Hey, mine." Liao Jun was a member of the organization department of the student union. He seemed to have some thoughts about Fu Yi. Although his family background was quite good, he was not a bully. Instead, he was more like a big brother. His grades were good, his personality was good, and he could be said to be sunny and handsome. After being rejected by Fu Yi several times, he didn't seem to have given up. He had secretly inquired about her university direction. It seemed like he was planning to run a long distance. However, Miss Rong's heart was like iron. She had already seen through the world of mortals from her parents. Although she didn't deliberately ignore him, she had always tactfully limited the distance between her friends. He was afraid that she couldn't escape the good friend card. After reading her long list of life plans, Huaisher doubted whether this person had any plans to get married. But this had nothing to do with him. After all, life wasn't a novel. There was more than just love. Even if they didn't get married, Huaisher believed that Fu Yi would be able to rely on herself in the future. Hearing their noises, Huaisher could only sigh. It's good to be young. He didn't know why, but a sense of vicissitudes of life rose in his heart. He suddenly became artistic. After a wave of team battles, Fu Yi still seemed a little worried. "You're really not eating?" "Really, I'm going home to study," Huaisher said. "I'm going to Jinling for the exam next week." Okay. Fu Yi didn't say anything else. She calmly said, "Then we'll meet in Jinling." "What did you say?" Huaisher was stunned. Before he could ask, the phone hung up. Huaisher was left standing alone in the middle of the road. He looked at the heavy traffic in front of him with a dumbfounded expression. He suddenly felt a little scared that Director Fu would bring people to Jinling. When he got home, he saw that the flowers that Feng Shu watered for the past 2 days had already bloomed. The originally bleak front yard had returned to its usual gentle appearance. Feng Shu was standing at the door. After checking the package, he signed it for the delivery man. After the delivery man left, Huaisher threw down his bag and saw a huge box in the living room. "What the hell? Where did you buy it? How much is it?" Huaisher stared at Crow and struck him 3 times. "Your teaching materials. I bought them from the official Giant Swan Tengu store of the Stoneware Society. Each set includes free shipping. They include 8 DVDs of master lectures. It's not expensive. Each set is only 4 million yuan. How much?" Huaisher was so shocked that he almost jumped up and poked a hole in the ceiling. "4 million? 4 million yuan for a bunch of crap? Knowledge is priceless, kid." Crow looked at him with disappointment. In this kind of monopolized industry, they can make as much money as they want. If you really learn it, you'll earn it back in a few years. My ass. It's all for you." Huaisher rolled his eyes and opened the box. He found that the Stoneware Society was shockingly stingy. The big iron box was wrapped in layers of bubble wrap. In the end, there were only 10 books. One was an introduction to alchemy that didn't have any nutritional value. There were also 2 mineral illustrated handbooks and 8 books on metals. They were all things that he already knew. Huaisher was furious. "You wanted to pay 4 million for these crap? Did you know? Once upon a time, there was an unlucky kid like you. His family was poor, but he was gifted." Crow said seriously. He didn't buy expensive teaching materials. He self-taught and passed the Stoneware Society's alchemy exam. Guess what happened next? He became a master? Huaisher asked tentatively. Later, when the results came out, the Stoneware Society found that they couldn't find the serial number and record of the teaching materials he bought in their database. They thought that he had stolen knowledge that didn't belong to them. They reported him to the Astronomy Society and arrested him. Crow said coldly. He was sentenced to 92 years in prison and hard labor for infringing the Stoneware Society's copyright. He's still in prison planting chrysanthemums. Chapter 161. Crow's poisonous chicken soup story was also very effective today. Huaisher shuddered after hearing it, and immediately scolded the shameless bastards of the Stonefort Society. "Do you think the society is used to invite people to dinner, embroider, and write calligraphy?" Crow sneered. "Protecting the interests of the group to the greatest extent is the foundation of an organization. With such a huge profit in front of them, the Stonefort Society even dared to split from the Pioneer Society. Moreover, miracles are originally luxuries. If you don't pay the price for it, it will only lead to disaster. With the tragic consequences of the abuse of alchemy and the huge monopoly profits behind, anyone would choose the conservative option." "Then what's this other piece of paper?" Huaisher took out a document from the bottom of the box. It looked like a patent, A patent certificate in your name. Crow said, haven't you been tinkering with that a few days ago? Metal explosives. I looked it up, but there was no relevant formula. After I bought this set of materials, I immediately registered one in your name. After the cheat, if an alchemy workshop buys your patent, they can use it to produce products. It's a buyout system. It's about 400,000 at a time, and the society takes a quarter. Although it's not much, no matter how small a mosquito's leg is, it's still meat. You can more or less earn some pocket money. This was a byproduct of Huaishir's improved knowledge of metals after he came back. The main body was made of unstable alloys, such as magnesium, tin, and cesium. It was smelted into shape in one go, and then ignited with alchemy fire to create an explosive effect. Although the effect was not very good, and it could only be used as a non-lethal weapon like a smoke bomb or a flash bomb, it could reach the power of a small fragmentation grenade if it was carefully made. It could also make up for his lack of damage output. Hearing that this thing could be sold for money, he was overjoyed. I'm going to be rich? What are you dreaming about? Crow looked at him as if he was an idiot. How many formulas do you think there are? No less than a few 100,000. There are more than 4,000 alchemy explosives that involve metal materials. It's more cost-effective than your formula. Your advantage lies in the fact that it's entirely made of metal. It can be used to great effect in certain situations, and you can rub it with your hands at any time. But do you think everyone has the alchemy fire? Without the alchemy fire to ignite it on the spot, it would have to be made in advance, which would reduce its popularity. Moreover, there are countless mature products on the market. How can there be room for a small workshop like ours to stir up trouble? Huaishir felt a chill in his heart when he heard this. He immediately comforted himself. After investing so much, there's finally hope of recovering the cost. It's fine as long as I can sell it and make a little profit. After discarding his dream of getting rich overnight, Crow inquired about Huaishir's progress. How far have you progressed with the silver blood potion? Huaishir scratched his head. According to your suggestion, we'll work on both ends. One will take 5 minutes and can be used as a small health potion. The other will only take about 4 seconds and can be used as an enhanced band-aid. All right, this way, you'll have a healing skill. Crow didn't ask for more. Something like the silver blood potion was enough. There was no need to invest more effort to specialize in it. If his alchemy level could be raised, then the effect would naturally rise. Moreover, the most technical part of this thing wasn't the potion itself, but the patented solvent that prevented the silver blood potion from solidifying after cooling. Otherwise, the silver blood potion would turn from liquid to solid after an hour of production. At that time, its original effect would be removed, and it would even become a poison. After all, not many people's stomachs were strong enough to digest metal. As for the solvent that prevented solidification, each workshop had their own techniques and methods, and the price was higher than the other. If it was for personal use, there was no need to buy it at all. In short, it's fine. Many big bosses can't reach your level. For the time being, there's no need to invest any more time. Crow spread his wings and motioned for him to follow him to the basement. In the darkness, when he passed through the basement's corridor, he heard the faint sound of electric current. The old light bulb hanging above his head flickered. But in the flickering of the light, Huaishir found that his body began to fade. When he deliberately entered the state of a ghost, he found that his body flashed and disappeared with the flickering of the light. In a dark place, his silhouette would melt into a dim gray fog, and under the dim light, it was difficult to feel his existence. It was like an illusion reflected by a projector in the dust. Crow noticed the abnormality in his body and looked back. His eyes were slightly satisfied. Very good. It seems that you've almost mastered the ghost. Should I prepare to advance? Huaishir asked. No rush. Crow shook his head. There are many ways to advance, but before that I still need to make a choice. To be honest, I'm still hesitating. What are you hesitating about? A lot of hesitation. For example, the future, your life, and other trivial things. Crow landed on the table, so I decided to wait and see. At least choose the most suitable one, right? Just choose one that's not a trap. Huaishir waved his hand. He wanted to cry for the cat. He was really scared of being tricked by Crow. Don't worry, if the plan doesn't go wrong, you won't have to drive illegal cars in the future. Crow waved his wings and pointed at the silver cross spear on the table. You can take that away. Cross spear compassion. Huaishur had awakened another type of origin substance weapon. It was a rare long weapon. Even though he didn't know how to use it, it could still be used to stab people. And its effect was to let the person who was stabbed by Huaishur feel the sorrow and pity in Huaishur's heart. It was as if he was saying, I didn't have any other choice. I didn't stab you on purpose. Who told you to be so disobedient? Even though it sounded quite strange, it was only when one was actually stabbed by it that they realized how vicious its effects were. Just like how the axe of wrath could cause a person's mind to be shaken, or how the rope of sorrow could cause a person to feel discouraged, the spear of compassion could cause an enemy's fighting spirit to crumble, causing them to think about what they were doing, whether or not everything they were doing had any meaning, and why they were doing it. Even if they were stabbed to death, they wouldn't feel any hatred or unwillingness in their hearts. Instead, they would feel calm and peaceful. It was basically the spear of salvation. After Huaishur had been stabbed, he had been in the state of a sage for a full hour. From then on, he no longer wanted to be Crow's test subject. Of course, the most important thing was the azure crown dragon's blood. It was as if there was an endless flow of dragon blood. The faint trace of blood constantly dripped with sticky, poisonous blood. The Philosopher's Stone's unique properties gave it inconceivable miracles. Wherever the blood dripped, a pure white iris flower would grow. After 10 minutes, it would wither along with the dissipating blood. If it danced, the whole practice field would become beautiful. Fragrant and pure petals would bloom in every corner, interweaving into a dazzling garden. Just this sound and visual effect alone made Huaishur want to give KP 100,000 likes. But what made him even more satisfied was the effect of the dragon blood. Decay. The most terrifying thing about the Azure Crown Dragon was its breath of decay that could compare to time. Wherever the breath passed, all things would decay. This characteristic seemed to have been inherited by the dragon blood, and now it was attached to Huaishur's spear. This led to the fact that when stabbed, once the dragon blood on the spear entered the victim's body, the victim's energy would begin to decline rapidly. If the dosage was high enough, it would even cause a temporary aging effect. Even if it wasn't tainted by the dragon blood, just being in this field of flowers and smelling its fragrance would cause one's energy to rapidly decline, causing dizziness and depression. Simply put, Huaishur would be able to enjoy beating up old people even more in the future. But the most troublesome thing was that this poison was also effective on Huaishur. He had no way of avoiding it. Thus, he could only ask Crow to study its properties and temporarily create an antidote. The result was the syringes on the table. Use one of the previous ones. It should last for about half an hour. Just use it carefully, Crow said casually. Now, we need to start a physical examination. It was still the same old routine. There were all sorts of common and uncommon methods, as well as blood tests and CT scans. Yes, CT scans. Crow had even bought a CT machine and placed it in the corner of the room. Every few days, she would call Huaishur over to take a picture. In any case, an ascendant's physique was very long, so this level of radiation was nothing. Actually, the main thing this time was to check if there were any side effects. When they were on the ship, Huaishur's origin substance and Van Helsing's origin substance had coexisted for too long. Generally speaking, this situation would cause Huaishur's consciousness to be completely covered by Van Helsing, turning him into a walking corpse. However, there was the artifact Book of Destiny, which carried all the memories of the first half of his life, ensuring his personality and soul's independence. Therefore, the only thing to worry about was that the contamination of the origin substance would cause slight changes to the body. Fortunately, everything was under control. It was just that Huaishur wasn't used to it. After being a level 3 ascendant for so long, and even acting as a fake holy light fighter, returning to his own body made him especially uncomfortable, especially since Van Helsing was one of the best among level 3 ascendants. Now, Huaishur even had to use all his strength to barely catch up to the foundation he had when he was Van Helsing, and sometimes he was far from it. The lag in his nerve reflexes allowed him to get used to it, but it was still uncomfortable. It's done. Crow raised his eyes from the results and pointed to the end of the basement, at the iron pile 20 meters away. Let me see your current limit of speed and strength. I'll try. Huaishur moved his body slightly, and darkness covered his body. His whole body was shrouded in darkness, and the crack in his chest surged with spiraling light. Feeling the majestic, dark origin substance in his body, he closed his eyes and exhaled the breath in his lungs. In the next moment, a sinister bloody light burst out from his eyes. A roar sounded. Chapter 162. In the blink of an eye, a gust of wind blew in the room. Amidst the deafening sound, the crossed spear appeared in Huaishur's hand. As he stepped forward, it tore through the air again, bursting forth with a shrill whistle. A blazing light, like melting steel, flashed and disappeared. Then there was the sound of something shattering. At the end of the basement, an iron stake covered with a special alloy had been penetrated by the spear blade, drilling a deep crack, and the two branches of the spear wedged into the steel. Amidst the crisp sound of the crack spreading, there was the sound of the alloy's surface peeling off. On the wall behind the iron stake, a crack silently appeared. Where the spear tip pointed, dust flowed down from the crack and piled up on the ground, forming a pile of white dust. At that moment, Huaishur, who had used all his strength, regained the speed and strength of a vampire, although the price was that he was almost exhausted and his arms were numb. But if he used the dust of the dispelled, he could even use this kind of attack a few more times. Even if he used the alchemy fire to control the explosion, he could divide the dust of the dispelled from the inside out into 16 layers and explode like a fuse, creating an even more exaggerated lethality in an instant. Very good. Crow seemed to have finally gained confidence. With your level, I can rest assured that you can participate in the demon-slaying competition. What competition? Huaishur was stunned. The demon-slaying competition. Crow said calmly, "You should know what it is just from the literal meaning, right? There's such a competition." Huaishur only felt that it was amazing. Sure enough, there were all kinds of strange things in this world. It was founded by a group of troublesome group leaders, and the location is in a small mobile border. It can be said that it's one of the most famous competitions in the border. This time, it's only a selection in the southern part of the Dongsha region. If you participate, the chances of winning are not small. The most important thing is that among the prizes, there are many products from hell, and there's a high probability that there will be materials related to your next advancement. Hearing about his advancement, Huaishur immediately became extremely cautious. But soon, he noticed the vocabulary in her words. Group leader? He was stunned. Which group's administrator? If you understand it that way, it's not too much of a problem. Crow looked at him speechlessly. The so-called leader of a large group is used by the people of the present realm to refer to the rulers of a part of the depths of hell. They're usually strong people who have lived in hell for hundreds of years. They are monsters among monsters. They themselves are the leaders and rulers of a certain race. Almost every one of them can represent the existence of a force in hell. Do you understand now? It sounds so strong. There are strong ones and weak ones. The strong ones can fight their natural enemies head-on, while the weak ones can be beaten up by you. Crow cautiously said, "This competition can be tacitly approved by the Astronomical Society and even be able to send out invitations in the present realm. This proves that their power is definitely not low. You have to be careful, don't offend the organizers. Being blacklisted is a small matter, but if they do something to you, then you'll be in trouble. Although they won't go as far as to kill their own contestants, they can still leave some kind of curse that will make you unlucky for decades. Moreover, their curses are especially torturous. The last person who messed around in the competition was cursed. Until now, everything he drank tasted like cold water. He hasn't drunk a mouthful of hot water for decades. Even his feces is not warm." Huaishur suddenly shivered after hearing this. He immediately reacted. No, these guys should generally be demons, right? Is there something wrong with spending money to have a demon-slaying competition? You'll know when you go. Crow looked at him with a complicated expression. This competition is very important to you, although it's a bit beyond your limits. I hope you can win. Don't worry, as long as there's no fourth step, I can still fight. Huaisher thought for a long time and encouraged himself. If you can solve it just by fighting, then it'll be easy. Crow sighed worriedly. It's rare for you to be so confident, so I won't discourage you. I'll be prepared later. I hope you can also use these tools flexibly. When does this competition start? Huaisher asked. What a coincidence, it's tonight. Crow revealed a smile that made Huaisher uneasy. Isn't this a coincidence? As she said this, she picked up the black invitation letter with some kind of hell's language written in gold and placed it in front of Huaisher. I wish you a safe journey. Midnight, 12 o'clock. On the lawn behind the Chalcedony Hall, Huaisher carried a huge iron box, as if he was delivering takeout. He also wore a cheap plastic Pepsi mask on his face. He looked down at the invitation letter in his hand, puzzled. He felt that there was something wrong with this Demon Slayer competition, but he couldn't put his finger on it. Carrying the box of secret weapons Crow prepared for him, he didn't even have time to open it before he was urged to go by Crow. But before he left, he was stopped by Feng Shu. Young master, that. He looked at the plastic mask on Huaisher's face that cost $2 and hesitated for a long time. Then he took out a cloth bag from his arms. It's a bit inappropriate to wear that kind of thing. If you don't mind, I have. Huaisher took it in puzzlement. When he opened the cloth bag, his face twitched behind the mask. Okay, he picked up the mask and a cloth bag. It was made of iron, and when he knocked on it, it made a clanging sound. If he guessed correctly, Uncle Fong must have used the hairdryer in the storage room in the backyard to cut it in half and welded it himself. In order to cater to his young master's strange aesthetic, he even found a can of spray paint from who knows where. After spraying it pink, he welded 2 screws on it to act as eyeballs. Steel Pepsi. Isn't this still Pepsi? Huaisher wanted to cry, but no tears came out. Seeing Feng Shu's expectant eyes, he could only squeeze out a smile and keep it on his face. Feng Shu looked at it attentively, picked up the paint brush in his hand, and painted 2 red circles on it. After that, he took a step back and smiled with relief. It was as if he was looking at the most handsome boy within a few hundred miles. Then I'll prepare breakfast and wait for you to come back. He nodded and saluted, then turned and left. Look, even Feng Shu is cheering for you. On Huaisher's shoulder, Crow sighed. You have to do your best. I feel even more powerless. What should I do? Then think of something better. For example, how about your savings? Crow said, I've spent more than 10 million and only have 800 left. You have to work harder to support your family. Please don't say any more, okay? Huaisher became more and more powerless. His whole body seemed to have turned pale. He didn't want to pay attention to this stupid thing. He picked up the invitation and walked onto the lawn. According to Crow's translation on the invitation, it was very simple to participate in the competition. All he had to do was hold the invitation and walk around the 3-way intersection a few times at a predetermined time. The organizer would receive his signal and pull him into the border. It sounded unbelievably convenient. But the problem was, where was he supposed to find the 3-way intersection? The intersection was easy to find, but suddenly asking Huaisher to find a 3-way intersection was a bit of a pain in the ass. In desperation, he could only follow Crow's instructions. Anyway, it was a road. His own road was also a road. During the day, Feng Shu used a lawnmower to push out a small path on the lawn. Why does it seem so unreliable? Under the quiet moonlight, Huaisher stared at the simple 3-way intersection on the lawn in front of him. With the invitation in hand, he took a step forward and then froze in place. It was foggy. The more he walked forward, the thicker the fog became, until he followed the ritual on the invitation and stood still at the 3-way intersection. After taking 10 steps in 3 different directions, the fog was so thick that he couldn't even see his own fingers. In a brief moment of absent-mindedness, Huaisher seemed to hear the faint sound of a bell. The fog suddenly dissipated. He was back at the 3-way intersection. But this time, he was no longer on the lawn of his house, but on a busy intersection that was wide enough for several carriages to come and go. In fact, there were really all kinds of old-fashioned carriages coming and going at the three-way intersection. With the light hanging on the carriages, Huaishur could see that there were human-like existences in the carriages. Even the coachman's face had scales or cheeks. In addition to horses, there were all kinds of messy things that were pulling the carriages. There was even an early simple car that drove past him, leaving a choking smoke behind. And in the car, the arrogant green-skinned goblin was still shouting angrily, go away, don't block the road." Huaishur was obedient and obediently moved to the side of the road. When he looked at the road sign, he found that the words on it were completely unrecognizable. Following his gaze, the words on the road sign twisted like a living creature and then turned into the Eastern Xiao language. Left, White Town. Right, Green Island Food Fair. Back, Gray Coast. "Go to Green Island. Remember not to go in the wrong direction," Crow reminded him. "This is an intermediate border. It will be troublesome if you get lost." "Food fair?" Huaishur was stunned. "Are you sure? Just go. Why are you asking so many questions?" Okay. As I walked forward, Huaishur felt that there were more and more people on the side of the road, as if they had suddenly walked out of Fork in the Fog. Most of them looked like humans, and quite a few of them were ascendants. Their bodies glowed faintly, and they carried all kinds of weapons with them. They seemed to be very skilled, and a few of them gave Huaishur a sense of threat. When those guys lowered their heads to look at people, their eyes were like looking at food. At some point, the ground under his feet had turned into a cement road. In the distance, lights that looked like a playground lit up, and there was a hubbub of voices. But when Huaishur raised his head, he felt a chill and froze on the spot. Crow looked at his stunned expression and could not help but sigh. "What's wrong? Why are you so surprised? Don't make people think that you're from the countryside, okay?" But the sky. Huaishur looked up at the sky, or rather, the thing that was supposed to be the sky, above the sky. As far as the eye could see, the bright starry sky had disappeared, and in its place was a turbulent ocean. Countless undercurrents surged, setting off layers of waves. The waves splashed, but they did not fall to the ground. The vast and boundless dark ocean enveloped everything. White sails could be vaguely seen jumping and sailing at the tip of the wind and waves. Separated by tens of thousands of meters, Huaishur could even hear the faint roar of countless currents colliding. The ocean was surging, constantly turbulent, as if it would pour down from the sky at any time, drowning everything. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.